The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 501 Immigration Issues. The immigration policy jointly developed by France and the Church was indeed very attractive, and it intercepted the vast majority of Germans who were going to the other side of the ocean, the United States. But it also added many problems. Unlike later generations, there was no so-called distinction between legal and illegal at that time. The state's control over its citizens was very poor, which resulted in uneven quality of immigrants. Originally, Austria's literacy rate had the honor of being the last in Germany, so it couldn't get any worse. But in fact, most of the immigrants who come to Austria to seek a living come from the lowest level of each country, and their quality is really not very high. What's even more frightening is that these groups like to form gangs, fight against different parties, and even bully locals. Coupled with the spread of greater Germanism ideas, social unrest has intensified, crime rates have soared, and large-scale vicious cases continue. In addition, there is the issue of religion. There is not much difference between the South German immigrants and the Germans in Austria in terms of language, customs, and habits, and they can almost seamlessly integrate into the local society. But the North Germans are completely different. A considerable number of them have received primary school education, and their language habits and pronunciation are very different from those of the Austrians. In addition, most of them believe in Protestantism. This made the North Germans form a special group, but they were not treated very well. As the saying goes, birds of a feather flock together, and these North German immigrants established countless small groups. What's even more frightening is that as Germans, they have a natural advantage in the competition model of the Austrian Empire. Coupled with their higher quality than other nationalities, their development speed is far beyond imagination. At this time, the ghettos of Vienna were almost occupied by North German immigrants, but they were not poor, but people who had made a name for themselves in the empire. There were even many high-quality talents that Franz came from North Germany who liked to live with these people together, but traditional Austrians look down upon these outsiders, so there are often some frictions between the two. But this is nothing compared to the situation in Bohemia, which originally had a large German population. Franz hoped to use North German immigrants to change the demographic structure, and preferably to eliminate the civil war. However, the reality is that millions of North Germans have poured into this place, directly becoming the third largest group in the area. Now the main local conflict has become the conflict between North and South Germans. As for the Czechs, who just want to farm the land and make money, the Jews are unhappy in the middle. Moravia is also facing a similar situation, and even the entire Lusitania region has more or less similar experiences. As for the Church, the role played by these servants of God is intriguing. Although they played an important role in rescuing people and bringing immigrants to the empire, they played a negative role in dealing with immigration conflicts. For example, the religious issue. Doesn't the Church think it will be solved as long as North Germans give up their Protestant beliefs? So a large number of priests were sent to come to proselytize, which greatly angered the Protestant alliance in North Germany. Since Austria today has very loose restrictions on religion, the Protestant alliance can build churches in the country. However, the competition for faith between the two sides has almost triggered a religious war again. That's why Franz put forward the principle of giving priority to Catholics when accepting Dutch refugees, because in the chaotic situation within the empire, it is simply unimaginable to bring in some Calvinists. In fact, North Germans and Dutch believe in different Protestant religions. It is well known that heresy is more terrifying than heresy. As for the Germans in St. Stephen's Crown territory, they also had many problems. After getting through the initial difficult times, they began to demand the establishment of schools, hospitals, post offices, and waterworks. This was nothing at all. Franz's original purpose was to add sand to Outer Lusitania, so it was understandable to improve living conditions, but soon this group was no longer satisfied with this. They demanded equal rights and even entry into the parliament of the Kingdom of Hungary. In addition, factories must be built and railways laid. This made Franz very angry, and he thought to himself, don't they have any idea at all? Join other people's parliaments and share their rights? If you still want to build factories and build railways, do you really think of yourself as a citizen of the special administrative region? So when hundreds of people were massacred by horse bandits on their way to protest in Pressburg, the nominal seat of the Hungarian parliament, he just pretended it never happened. Also confused are the Magyarists, whose extreme behavior makes it difficult for them to get along well with other ethnic groups, and through this incident, most of the peoples in the Crown territory of St. Stephen chose to stand firmly on the side of Austria. After all, following the Magyarists is a dead-end point. In fact, from the perspective of future generations, the Magyarists should absorb the North German immigrants as a minority, to strengthen their own power, but that would not be a true Magyarist. Such madness would bring only pain and destruction. At this time, Metternich had figured out Franz's plan, and he was preparing to unilaterally negotiate tariffs with the province of Illyria. In fact, the Hungarian side has previously agreed to the proposal to jointly negotiate tariffs. After all, Austria has given them a veto power. In theory, the Hungarians will be invincible. As for the immigration problem in Italy, it was completely unintentional. During this period in history, northern Italy was in a period of decline. It will become a period of regression after independence, but at this time, after a series of operations by Franz and Friedrich's uncle and nephew, northern Italy has regained its vitality, and the port of Venice has become the most prosperous port in the entire Mediterranean. As a result, a large number of Italians poured into the empire. Now they have surpassed the Hungarians to become the second largest ethnic group in Austria, and if this trend continues, they will soon surpass the German population. Franz's second wish seems to be coming true. According to the analysis of the Imperial Statistical Office, the Italians will surpass the German population in 1847 and ascend to the throne of the largest ethnic group in the empire. Generally speaking, an increase in population is a good thing for a country, but Italians are a very special group. They are very home-loving and have a strong sense of family. This can be seen from Franz II, who was very considerate of his family. But these people often lacked ambition, and almost every official sent to northern Italy complained about the inefficiency of local officials. Immigrants who come to northern Italy usually come in family units and like to live in cities because they can easily find jobs there. However, the local land carrying capacity is limited. There are more porters on the dock than goods, and there are people everywhere that the government cannot drive away. And these guys have no desire to immigrate or work outside of Italy. At the same time, they are proud of their culture and history, have little interest in German, and are even more dismissive of Austrian culture. Than the Italian countries, especially the branches of the Habsburg family, complained that Austria was robbing people, so they could only lay waste and demand compensation from the Vienna court. Chapter 502 Beginning and Ending. Although the current corruption and immigration issues in Austria are already very difficult, the previous gold ship incident is the most urgent one that needs to be resolved. After all, it involves money and wealth. California's gold was very important to Franz and his country. It was with the support of this windfall that the empire was able to develop its colonies while developing domestic industry and even paid welfare benefits to its citizens, shareholders. But now that Americans have learned the secret, it is impossible to sit back and relax. Although France and the United States had previously learned about the blockbuster news about the California gold mine from successive pieces of information, they did not know the specific output and detailed information of the gold mine before this. But things are different now. The officials responsible for transporting gold are stealing it, taking away not only the gold, but also the secrets of California's treasure land, such as troop allocation, defense focus, maneuver strategies, and even urban and industrial structures. Franz has no way of knowing how many secrets these guys took away. As for the method of assassination, don't think about it for the time being. Because of the timeliness issue, too long has passed between sending people from the other side of the ocean to investigate, draw conclusions, and then report to the home country. Besides, the so-called assassination is not a Washang assassin, nor is it possible to fight head-on like Naruto. It requires a lot of intelligence support, a long period of lurking, and patient waiting, and the success rate is very low. Point now Franz is not sure whether the Americans will publish this information, or whether they will draw on the rich experience of their Anglo-Saxon ancestors and rob Austrian merchant ships everywhere from now on. Point. But given the situation in North America at this time, Franz had the worst inference. That is, John Tyler might restart the US-Mexican War. Although this is inevitable in a sense, the future prince still does not want to come so early. Point in fact, the United States was also facing many resistances at home and abroad at this time, the first of which was the French colony of Texas. That's right. The emergence of the French has greatly reduced the Americans' ability to act, and greatly inhibited their ability to expand. The latter also had to think about the possible impact of their actions on the former. The French made a deep impression on them when they first fought against the US military in Texas. 8 years later, those who participated were still fresh in their memories. However, the United States did not have much of a standing army at that time. Point after all, this costs taxpayers money. Although successive presidents have argued for it, there is a saying that there are policies from above and countermeasures from below. Point. So taxpayers decided to fund their own militia groups, which sounds ridiculous, but is actually legal. Point. Yes, some people say that the early US Constitution was a huge business license, and this is indeed true in a sense. Point. As long as you have enough financial resources, you can even raise an army yourself and contract the defense of the lower state. Point. This so-called militia group naturally does not pay attention to so-called talent, but focuses on efficiency. So what kind of corps has the highest efficiency? The answer is to live on free wages and hire temporary workers. That's why the former governor of Texas said that he was sure to get back the land that France had lost. Point. What's interesting is that the US military at this time actually had no fear of the French army, and even thought the tactic of skirmishing and lining up to kill was ridiculous. The funniest thing is that the French cavalry actually used sabers when charging, instead of the more efficient pistols. Even children in the United States know that a cowboy can deal with 12 Indians at the same time, because a cowboy only has 12 bullets in his gun. A cold joke at the time. John Taylor was a very pragmatic man. He didn't believe those generals who sat in the house all day long. He sent people to the militia on the border to ask the local soldiers what the strength of the French was. The results he obtained made him feel excited. The French army was already vulnerable. Point. However, the British in Oregon were a real threat. Palmerston was very difficult to deal with, and those Western immigrants seemed to only care about immediate interests. The United States seems to have every advantage on this road to the Pacific, but it has never been able to overcome this obstacle. Point. To be honest, Palmerston worked hard for the interests of the British Empire this time. He refused to implement the appeasement policy of the Tory Foreign Secretary, used thousands of colonial troops to fight wits and courage with hundreds of thousands of immigrants in the United States, and deceived the other party's life. Almost not being able to take care of myself is truly a stroke of genius. However, his series of unnatural operations made the governor of Canada, Sir Charles Metcalfe, a little embarrassed. Point. You must know that the latter was forced by John Tyler to rebuild the US-Canada border as soon as he took office, and in a series of subsequent events, he was even more suppressed by him. Point. But at this time, the former reversed the situation between the United States and Canada in the Oregon region as soon as he arrived, which made him even more incompetent. So John Taylor and the Canadian Governor General resorted to a trick at the same time, which was to bribe senior British officials with money. Point. Once the money was in place, things became easier to do, and soon Whitehall, another name for the British government in London, issued an order to transfer Palmerston to the Indian colonies. As for the reason, it is of course whatever it takes, and usually this domineering politician offends a lot of people. Point. Naturally, there are many people who want to see him suffer misfortune at this time. After all, India is now a powder keg with constant internal uprisings and two powerful enemies externally, the Sikh Empire and the Afghan Empire. Point. He was also helpless, but this genius who jumped repeatedly could not disobey London's orders. Even if he wanted to go beyond the level and ask the Queen for help, Victoria, who valued morality very much, would not do what Palmerston did at Windsor Castle. talk to such a guy. Prince Albert was a wise and informal ruler, but Palmerston also had a bad relationship with him, because the latter was an old fox, while the former was a born hunter. But the most important thing is that the two men have different political opinions. The latter's radical diplomatic strategies disgust the former. The former is more inclined to solve domestic conflicts and reform the existing system of the British Empire. Prince Albert is a politician who is close to the people. He understands the sufferings of the people, is rigorous, rational, and very pragmatic. Enthusiastic about science, established public libraries, museums, funded universities, and even held the First World's Fair, Exposition of All Nations Industry, the 1851 London World's Fair, to show the public the miracles of the Industrial Revolution and effectively enhance Britain's international prestige. They campaigned for the unemployed, worked hard to raise wages for workers, and tried to change the treatment of the poor, showing great concern and sympathy for the poor at the same time. He took a tough stance and banished the Queen's former mentor William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne, and fired Palmerston, the popular foreign minister. He was the first royal husband to dare to say no to Parliament since Mary II's husband William III in 1689, and he could be called the strongest son-in-law in the 19th century. Transforming London's public health facilities and personally delivering food and medicine to the most dangerous places when a plague broke out can almost be called a heroic figure. Palmerston knew that his transfer was a foregone conclusion and did not hesitate, but he still left a gift to the Americans, which could be regarded as a beginning and an end. Chapter 503 Undeclared War. Having solved Oregon and Texas, two major concerns, John Taylor began his next plan. That is to continue sending Indians out of the country as gifts. After all, the President of the United States who has never massacred Indians is like the Tsar who has never fought the Russo-Turkish War, as if he has no soul. John Taylor wanted to be a great president, so he had to hit hard on this matter. Although the Americans' actions to expel the Indians have continued, it is obviously impossible to leave mark in history without doing some tricks. So the American commander signed the Second Move Westward Order. The First Westward Movement Order was used to break through Oregon and attempt to enter California. Although it failed, it still caused a lot of trouble for Austria. The temptation of the Second Westward March was slightly stronger and more civilized than the first, because this time John Taylor claimed that the Indians would become the owners of the land he conquered and would be regarded as American citizens. The two nations will always be friendly into the future. Of course, there are still some inherent contradictions in the United States, such as the North-South issue, such as the contradiction between industry and commerce and agriculture and animal husbandry, but these are not important. The important thing is that 54-year-old President John Taylor and 24-year-old Julia Gardner are married. A marriage with such a large age gap will naturally be criticized, but the former feels that it is not important in the face of true love. After he solved the major issues in his life, he began to solve the major issues related to the destiny of the United States. On the other hand, Mexican President Tazanana is still full of expectations that his little trick will succeed. He hopes to retaliate to the other party with the same revenge. Over the years, the Mexican military leader has eliminated countless competitors, defeated countless rebels, and quelled countless rebellions with the support of Austria. He felt that his name as Napoleon of North America was truly deserved. Of course, his subordinates also know what kind of character the boss has, and will not spoil the mood of their immediate boss. But Tazanana never thought about why he always pressed the good and picked up the good. The rebellion seemed endless and the enemies were endless. Although he achieved many glorious victories, these accomplishments overwhelmed him. In fact, the most cruel and torturous situation in the world is the Civil War. When facing the Americans, Tazanana will spare women, children, and anyone who is unable to resist. But when faced with traitors in Mexico, he almost never showed mercy, ranging from thousands to tens of thousands. But even the murderer king will be soft-hearted sometimes, let alone an ordinary person like Tazanana. When violent methods didn't work, he wanted to use gentle methods. However, the political level of the president and his team is very limited, and the only gentle method they can understand is to distribute money. However, when the market structure does not change, and the supply of goods does not increase, This approach is simply to increase inflation. To be honest, Franz had been thinking about letting the Mexicans use the Austrian money. Now, President Tazanin directly caused the Mexican Eagle Ocean to devalue, and the people complained, and rebellions broke out. In this chaotic environment, Austria's anticipatory banknotes naturally replaced the Mexican eagle as hard currency, and Tazanin also became the first magical president to devalue his country's metal currency. Since the OMO Joint Development Company was actually under the control of France, it had a very good reputation. Coupled with its special relationship with the President of Mexico, it even later assumed the responsibility of issuing Mexican banknotes. It's just that this troubled country is not suitable for issuing banknotes at all, because the Mexican government's credibility is too poor, and banknotes are depreciating faster than they can be printed. Under Franz's deliberate guidance, the country's agriculture had made great progress, but its industry and commerce were in retreat. Tazanin didn't care about that. He only cared about how much tax he could collect. Having such a person in power would be great for the OMO United Development Corporation, which resides above this country. But there are also some problems, that is, the fire prevention, theft prevention, and the prevention of old Americans, that Franz emphasized many times, have only been ignored by the Mexican president. At this time, the vast area of New Mexico has long been infiltrated into a sieve by American immigrants. New Mexico at this time included the modern states of New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, and Nevada. Tazanin once considered moving the people in the southern rebel areas north to Cheyenne, but new rebellions arose, and he gave up after several iterations later. Mexico organized border inspection teams, but these so-called troops were in name only. Otherwise, John Cena in California would not have to offer bounties to hunt down illegal immigrants in the United States. What is even more frightening is that among Tazanin's men, some small warlords completely disobey the central government's orders and are even bribed by Americans to do things for the United States. Although Mexico claims to have 300,000 troops, 100,000 of them only exist on paper. Another 100,000 cannot be mobilized at all. They need to quell and suppress local rebellions. The remaining 100,000 are in the vast New Mexico area, like a blind man. Therefore, Franz doubted their ability to hold on to their current territory. In fact, France's attitude will greatly affect the direction of the situation in North America, but Louis Philippe was very disdainful of corresponding with people like John Taylor. Moreover, he was not too interested in the Americans' proposal to jointly attack Mexico, and at the same time expressed doubts about the two countries' respective offensive lines. The route given by John Taylor was that France attacked from the south of 37° north latitude, while our side attacked from the north of 37° north latitude. It seemed that the French had some advantages, because the territory was larger. However, the main force of the Mexican army is almost all in the area south of 37° north latitude. Compared with this, the Mexican territory north of 37° north latitude is almost undefendable, and has no troops to defend. And would the Americans attacking California anger the Austrian Empire? It is unlikely that they will travel across the ocean to support Mexico, but will they cause a bloody storm on the European continent in retaliation? You must know that France and Austria at this time were only separated by a wall. Whether it was from Namur, northern Italy, or Alsace and Lorraine, the Austrian army could pass unimpeded. This reminded Louis Philippe of one of his predecessors, Louis XVI, who sold himself to aid the United States. The lessons learned from the past forced him to think twice before acting, and the result of the king's deliberation was naturally to do nothing, euphemistically calling it "let nature take its course." But John Taylor was a very pragmatic man. After he obtained the local militia that could solve the threat from Texas, he decided to launch the US-Mexico War. In fact, when the Mexicans received the news of the war, the US military was already in the hinterland of Mexico. Of course, this is not an undeclared war, but I declared war, but you didn't receive it. Chapter 504, War. The reason for starting the US-Mexican War this time is very outrageous. The cause was actually the dissatisfaction of the border general stationed in northern New Mexico. Now Utah, USA, due to insufficient bribes, so the underfed Mexican general was ready to continue asking for bribes, but the United States felt that the time was ripe and invited this fool to take a shot. The shrewd US military originally thought that it could save a lot of money because the opponent's army without its leader would definitely fall into chaos and then be defeated by its own elite. But the result was quite ironic. As soon as this general who was greedy for money and invested in the United States died, he was succeeded by another general who was resolutely anti-American. As a result, the US troops who had just entered the hinterland of Mexico were ambushed, and they were caught off guard and fled back to the mainland in a hurry. Then John Tyler gave a speech at the White House, declaring that Mexicans have invaded our borders and spilled American blood on American soil. This sentence should have been said by his next president, but due to the early outbreak of the US-Mexican War, the protagonist of this sentence also changed. But what hasn't changed is the outcome, which marked the official start of the US-Mexican War. John Tyler condemned the actions of the Mexicans, and in response, had to regretfully sign a declaration of war. However, this is all an illusion. The Americans had already made a lot of preparations before this, which is the so-called destiny theory. God has long ago decided that the Western Hemisphere belongs to the Americans, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and perhaps from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Democracy is so perfect that it is not limited by any national boundaries. Expansion is a providential means of enlightening the masses of people in neighboring countries who are ruled by tyrants. It is not imperialism but forced salvation. New land needs to be constantly acquired to create living space. Since we have become an independent people, it is as natural a law of nature as the necessity of the Mississippi to flow into the ocean. In fact, the idea of colonial expansion has not changed since the early days of the founding of the United States of America. It's just that it was a little restrained before because it was too weak, but now the US economy has surpassed Spain, the former great power, which has exposed its hidden claws and become unscrupulous, and under this continuous propaganda offensive day after day, year after year, some Americans actually believe it and feel that the land of Mexico and Canada is what the great America deserves. At the same time, US military forces have already been deployed on the US-Mexico border. According to the military, the federal army at this time had at least 130,000 people, and according to the plan, at least 300,000 people were mobilized. The number in history was 42,000, which increased to 150,000 after mobilization. Moreover, the United States has never stopped sending expedition teams to the west over the years. As early as the Jackson era, retired soldiers were hired to go deep into the Mexican border to draw maps. Coupled with the help of American immigrants over the years, Americans know their land even better than Mexicans. On the other hand, Tazanana was enjoying wonderful performances from Europe at the Tazanana Opera House in Mexico City, the largest opera house in the world at this time. In addition to him, his lover and the fighting cock, there were 3 generals with golden chests and 6 fully armed colonels in the box. These people were the so-called top Mexican officials. This guy has no sense of crisis at all, and even paid huge sums of money to reward the screenwriters and performers. Instead, it was the Austrian side who first discovered the crisis and sent a message to Tazanana in Mexico City. In fact, Franz had already asked someone to deliver his own handwritten letter before, reminding the proud president to be careful of threats from the east. However, the latter turned a deaf ear to it because he had received similar letters countless times and had long been a little numb. Historically, the current Mexican army only had 25,000 troops, but now, with the help of Franz, Tazanana can afford to support an army of 300,000 people on the books. Although the actual number is 200,000, their strength is 8 times that of before. There is no reason to lose to those annoying Americans so easily. However, there is also an unstable factor, and that is France. The decision of the Gallic rooster at this time will undoubtedly affect the balance of the war. Franz also thought about setting up a situation for Anglo-Austrian joint intervention, but if the interests were big enough, he really couldn't ignore Louis Philippe's ambitions. However, the temporary allies of Britain and Austria, who share different dreams, may not necessarily work together, and in the eyes of those within the empire, California is always someone else's land and will need to be returned sooner or later. The most important point is that the United Mexico United Development Corporation is run for the purpose of making money, not for the purpose of colonizing or invading Mexico. Therefore, there will not be as one-sided support for war in the country as before. In addition, the current empire is not yet ready to fight a cross-ocean war with the great powers. It is simply nonsense to let it join this war now. The only thing France can count on is the Austrian troops stationed in California at this time. He hopes that Archduke Karl Ferdinand will be a military genius like his brothers to guard this treasure point. Another way is to send as many umbrella employees as possible and organize medical teams and military observers to be sent to Mexico at the same time point. Although it is cruel to say this, war is definitely a catalyst for medical progress, especially in trauma medicine and surgical technology. As for the so-called military observers, they are of course selling dog meat in sheep's clothing. After all, the Mexicans' military level is more worrying than their political level. Moreover, the Austrian officers can also gain new enlightenment from this war and can also learn and make progress. You must know that one general succeeds and 10,000 bones wither is by no means a joke. If there must be a bloody lesson, it would be best if the bloodshed was not Austrian blood. Of course, the media and churches must also participate in building momentum. The biggest black point is the Americans and Eclad War. In fact, this barbaric approach was exactly in line with Europeans' views on immigrants to the New World at this time point. As long as the media continues to exaggerate it appropriately, Americans will not be able to clean it up, even if they want. Mexico is a Catholic country and the church has a strong influence. The church can take the opportunity to strengthen its influence on it and encourage the locals to resist the aggression of the Yankees. In addition, the most critical thing is to put pressure on France, a filial son of Catholicism, hoping that he will show his favor for the sake of his fellow believers. Armando Parley was the Mexican ambassador to the United States at this time. He asked the Washington government to return his passport and send him back to the country, but he was refused. Therefore, the diplomatic envoy could only sneak back to the country on a black ship, and it would take several weeks for the American so-called declaration of war to reach Tassinana's hands within the United States. Southern slaveholders did not support the war because the newly added states would not become slave states. Under the previous agreement, increasing the number of free states is a disguised form of weakening their own power. Naturally, they are extremely reluctant to do this kind of thing that harms themselves and benefits others. However, John Taylor did not expect these short-sighted guys to be of any use. He was convinced of the weakness of France, so he decided to let the southern slave owners defend against possible French attacks. In fact, this president supports slavery and is a man-of honor himself. However, he is a believer in the Constitution of the United States. He considers more the overall interests of the United States and believes in the so-called destiny theory. Therefore, he is not interested in expansion. Naturally, there is strong support for extending the borders of the United States. Chapter 505, War. Although the Mexican Border Patrol put up a desperate resistance, the 2,000 people could only sit back and wait to die in the face of tens of thousands of US troops who had been prepared for battle. It would take at least several days for the scouts sent out to convey the message to reach the nearest Mexican military camp for help, and it would take 1 to 2 months to reach the capital, Mexico City. The US military generals on the other side were told that gold worth at least hundreds of millions of dollars was waiting for them in California. As a result, the Yankees advanced very quickly and only sent a small number of old and weak soldiers to besiege the strongholds and barracks encountered on the way. Of course, most of these Mexican soldiers did not live up to expectations. Almost all of them chose to surrender without fighting. Being a prisoner of war is not a glorious thing, but it is commonplace for Mexican soldiers. After all, their country has had so many civil wars that these soldiers can't count them. However, the Americans do not intend to accept these guys into their army, but they will not let them go like Napoleon did. The next fate of these Mexicans can be roughly divided into 2 types. One is to follow the US military troops and be used as livestock, and the other is to be sold to local American immigrants as slaves. It's Just that the price of these Mexican whites or mixed race children is not comparable to the price of black slaves, and they usually only sell for about $30. It took the US military advancing along the 37° north latitude to reach California in less than a month. What's even more astonishing is the Mexican army's response speed. Nearly a month after the war began, they were still defending against possible attacks from Texas. The French side strictly abided by Louis Philippe's principle of standing still. Only Guizot once wanted to try to take a piece of the pie point, but he soon realized one thing, that is, both the United States and Mexico were strictly guarding France. Only this time Guizot believed that Louis Philippe was right and that it was indeed not the right time to join the war. Although the focus of the US military's offensive was California controlled by Austria, after all, it was invading territory belonging to Mexico. Tarazona decided to lead his troops north to recover the lost territory. A fierce battle broke out between the two sides on the Rio Grande. The Mexican army was 7 times larger than the US troops stationed here. As a result, Tarazona remembered the previous tragedy. He refused to send superior troops to attack, but chose to engage in artillery battles with the enemy. However, the US military at this time was no longer what it used to be. They gave up their previous small caliber artillery and old-fashioned cast iron cannons, and chose expensive but efficient bronze cannons. In fact, the quality of bronze cannons at that time was much stronger than cast iron cannons, and could even compete with Austrian steel cannons. The US military purchased 98 6-pound bronze cannons in 1838. After that, it purchased large quantities every year. By 1844, the number of bronze cannons in the US military was close to 350. The Mexican army uses all antiques made by Austria and Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. These old-fashioned cast iron cannons are as dangerous to themselves as they are to the enemy, because they are very easy to explode, especially when firing continuously. The US troops stationed in the Rio Grande were equipped with nearly 80 bronze cannons and quickly suppressed the Mexican army with 150 artillery pieces. The artillery battle was very cruel. Bronze cannons had better ductility and could add more gunpowder. The cannons ejected faster and had a higher hit rate. Therefore, they had the advantage in the artillery battle. At the same time, Tarazona did not allow the cavalry and infantry to charge, which greatly damaged the morale of the Mexican army. This kind of fighting is a kind of torture, especially for those strong-blooded Indian soldiers. They are not afraid of death, but they are not used to being named and slaughtered in this way. It is gratifying that the Mexican army successfully eliminated several teams of American troops transporting supplies. The latter's pistol cavalry once again lost to the light cavalry in a short encounter. However, this cannot be blamed on the pistol cavalry. After all, as attackers, the Mexicans have 2 cavalry divisions, while the US military transport team only has 1 or 2 companies at most. But these victories were still not enough to encourage and prevent a pessimistic mood from spreading in the army. Tarazona realized that this could not continue. Then he remembered what his idol did in 1812. At night, the Mexican army left enough campfires and quietly evacuated the battlefield. The bright bonfire became the culprit of covering up the truth. At this time, yellow fever had broken out in the US military camp. Because mosquitoes are too active in the summer, and most of the people who went to Mexico this time were northerns who had no resistance to the virus, a large number of soldiers soon lost their combat effectiveness. Yellow fever is an acute infectious disease caused by the yellow fever virus and spread mainly through the bites of Aedes mosquitoes. This disease has an extremely high mortality rate and is highly contagious. Even today, there is no specific treatment, and prevention is the main approach to dealing with this virus. Historically, this kind of death claimed the lives of nearly 10,000 Americans during the Mexican-American War. At this time, the number of US soldiers was larger and the sanitary conditions were worse. Moreover, they chose to camp by the river and sent troops in the summer, which greatly increased the number of US soldiers' risk of contracting this virus. When the Americans discovered that the Mexicans had withdrawn their troops the next day, the American general and his adjutant embraced each other to celebrate the aftermath, and at the same time, declared that they had won the Battle of the Rio Grande. Although there are still thousands of corpses of US military transport teams on the road not far away, the withdrawal of the Mexican army is the best proof. At the same time, Tazanana declared that he was the winner because he blocked the Yankees in the barracks for a week, wiped out many US military convoys, and captured several flags, so Mexico was the one who really laughed. The final winner, both sides felt good about themselves, but the war did not escalate further. First of all, the purpose of this group of American vanguards led by General Taylor was to hold the supply line point, and the Mexican side naturally knows how serious yellow fever is, and those mosquitoes don't just bite Americans. Tazanana is anxiously waiting for enough mosquito nets and doctors to be transported to the front line, otherwise he knows exactly what will be the next step for him. After all, this virus has not broken out in Mexican army camps once or twice. On the other hand, the first American soldiers who arrived in California were stunned by the richness of this land. In fact, after many years of management in Austria, it has become a rich oasis. In fact, the land in California is already very fertile and very suitable for agricultural production. On the one hand, Austria cannot live by the primitive hunter-gatherer way of killing bison and eating beef every day. In addition, there are more laborers on hand, so they started agricultural planting. Of course, this strategy of focusing on agriculture in California was also inspired by Franz. After all, he knew that this place would be one of the most important granaries in the United States and later generations. Naturally, this also has sustainable development strategy considerations, because non-renewable gold mines will be exhausted sooner or later. At this time, the first group of US soldiers who entered California had become underground miners, and they could finally see the precious gold. They just need to take it out with their own hands and then hand it over to others. How could such a situation be so cruel? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 506, The Promised Land. The US military can take a month to cross the Rocky Mountains along the river valley, then enter Death Valley through the Great Desert, bypass the Sierra Nevada mountains, and reach the promised land of the US government. This is also thanks to the fact that almost every one of them is riding a horse or two, but the marching speed of people and horses has long reached its limit. It is inevitable that these American vanguard troops will be disconnected from the baggage and artillery troops behind them. They discovered that California was full of fertile fields and herds, which inspired the bestiality in this group of people. The Indian villages and aboriginal Wubeo living in the outermost areas became the first targets of this group of beasts. The Indians naturally knew what kind of people the Americans were, so they put up a desperate resistance, and at the same time, sent people to attack the people in Los Angeles. The Austrian army asked for help. The local Hispanics still have a sense of luck. They feel that they are white and can negotiate terms with Americans as equals. The US military is naturally welcome to negotiate, but once people come, they can't even think of leaving. In this way, the Americans deceived the doors of one fort after another and looted them. The US troops who had gone through thousands of miles to reach California no longer had much humanity at this time. They were like a group of beasts, killing, burning, and robbing everything they could get, and turning everything they could not take away into ruins. But the good times for Americans did not last long, because the Indians and Spanish natives in California were also accustomed to bloodshed. Soon these aborigines caused heavy losses to the US military, and at the same time the Austrian army, which had been waiting for opportunities, also began to take action. John Cena is a businessman who always likes to maximize profits, such as now. Those indigenous people can only understand what justice means after they are beaten violently by the democratic and free America. Every country will promote the rationality and legitimacy of its colonial rule, and Austria is no exception. France even developed a theory specifically for this purpose: holiness, justice and redemption, of which justice is the title. As the most senior civil servant in California, John Cena would naturally have the theory developed by Franz engraved in his bones. He needed to always remind himself to act in accordance with this principle. Now is a good time to seek justice. After all, the Americans are actually here for the gold mines, but Austria will not give up these golds no matter what, so the two sides must be in a fight to the death point. Archduke Karl Ferdinand was a ruthless defense machine. He had been studying the direction and means of the enemy's possible invasion for so many years in California. He was fully prepared at both the north and the south point. Now all it takes is an order to tighten the encirclement and deal with these intruding enemies. But he also has his own worries, which are threats from the sea points due to transportation problems. The simplest and most reasonable way to transport gold from California back to Austria is not to take the land route, but to take the sea route. First go to Costa Rica or Nicaragua, then take the land route, and then return across the Atlantic Ocean. Austria Point. Therefore, all important cities in California are built along the coast. If a fleet comes along the coast, Austria will not be able to fight back at this time point. Archduke Karl Ferdinand did seek advice from his brother, the naval marshal, and even hired fort experts and shipbuilders, but the so-called coastal defense was still in name only point due to the lack of heavy artillery. The so-called forts cannot exert their strength at all. As for building ships, it is much more difficult than building cannons. First, a dry dock scared Archduke Karl Ferdinand. It was not just the cost that was surprising, but the man-hours and manpower required, which was still an extravagance for California at this time point. In fact, there are only 2 dry docks in the whole of Austria, one in Venice, and one in Trieste point. However, the deep water harbors in California do have the potential to build dry docks, but it is still too extravagant and the gains outweigh the losses. Back to business. The US military pioneers still holding M1795 Springfield rifles faced the Austrian army equipped with M1841 front-loading rifles using mini bullets. Not only that, the US military was also out of touch with the subsequent baggage units. They had no artillery support. While Austria was equipped with a large number of cavalry artillery and anti-infantry rockets, the Austrian army first used a large amount of intelligence to lock the location of the American vanguard. The latter mistook a Spanish aboriginal fort group for a city and was launching a siege on it point. In fact, due to the lack of heavy firepower in the US military, soldiers could only attack the indigenous people hiding in buildings with huge casualties. This is certainly not the style of the US military, and it is even less likely to be accepted by these cowboys who yearn for freedom point. In fact, the strength of the US military is several times that of the Aborigines in Wubao. Although the opponent has the terrain advantage, they only have some old-fashioned flintlock guns in their hands. In order to maintain its rule, Austria severely restricted the fighting strength of the local indigenous people. They were not allowed to have any weapons of war, and they were not allowed to hoard more than 60 kilograms of black powder. The US military is actually winning this battle, but there will always be casualties in a war. The question is who will be the scapegoat. The previous charge has proven that the opponent's marksmanship is not bad point. If we attack by force, the casualties will be very heavy point. In fact, if you start fighting each other without even trying, it's not an army at all. Damn. Austrians. Can't they just hand over everything and die quietly? Colonel Abbott cursed. William, do you dare to come with me? Colonel Dardo said jokingly. I have already lost 16 people in the attack just now. Why should I let my people go? If you like me, I will take less of them. Colonel Abbott didn't want to sacrifice his men anymore. Originally, his own people died the most when crossing the desert, so now he has the least say point. If you had these brothers in your hands, I'm afraid those guys won't even share the soup with you point. Colonel Abbott had this idea, and so did other US military officers. After all, everyone wants to eat meat, but no one wants to lose their front teeth point. As a result, more than 4,000 American troops were in a stalemate with the Aborigines in Wubao. What they didn't know was that the brother troops on the other side of the mountain had been wiped out by the Austrian army and the native Indians, and even they themselves became someone else's prey point. In fact, the US military lacks intelligence on Austria, and they always believe that it is impossible for the Austrian army, which has only more than 10,000 people, to split up its forces. After all, neither side knew the other's strength, but they were wrong. The Austrian side did a good job in intelligence work, and the indigenous people in California were its informants when the US military discovered a large number of Austrian troops suddenly coming out from behind and exchanged fire with them. They realized that the ones being surrounded were not regular Austrian troops at all. Chapter 507. On the plain with nowhere to hide, anti-infantry rockets exploded in the air. As a burst of white smoke rose, countless small steel balls shot towards the American soldiers, who had nowhere to hide with the sound of breaking wind. Then there were bursts of sounds of steel balls penetrating flesh, followed by miserable wails, but this was just the beginning, and soon the cavalry cannon was also pushed up. Before the Americans, who were stunned by the anti-infantry rockets, could organize a counterattack. The cavalry artillery opened fire. The caliber of these cavalry guns was usually only 3 to 4 pounds, but it was sufficient for shooting infantry. However, due to the long distance, the bullets used were not shotguns, but solid bullets, and blooming bullets. Theoretically speaking, when shooting this kind of live target, the effect of using explosive ammunition will be better. But in fact, due to the limitations of the technical conditions at the time, the power of the explosive bombs was far less powerful than that of later generations. Unless high explosive bombs blasted from naval guns are used to cause large-scale damage, ordinary explosive bombs can only explode into a few petals, or even only 2 petals, and are not powerful enough to deter the enemy. Solid bullets are completely different. These shells have strong penetrating power, good storage speed, long range, and high hit rate, which can give the opponent a great deterrent effect against dense formations. In the Battle of Zorndorf in 1758, a Prussian artillery battalion killed 42 Russian soldiers with a single solid bullet. Faced with the sudden artillery attack, the US military did not react like headless flies. On the contrary, these people showed amazing reaction speed. The officers immediately asked the soldiers to reorganize their formation and prepare to attack the Austrian side. You must know that these American advanced troops are strong men who can travel through mountains and rivers through countless death zones in the face of lack of supplies, but the Austrian side has long been used to seeing this kind of people. They are very experienced. The artillery fire was accurately focused on the positions of American officers and soldiers trying to fight back. No matter how brave a human being is, he is still made of flesh and blood. A solid bullet hit a US military officer in the head. The big head immediately exploded like a watermelon, and his adjutant and an unlucky private were all sent away. Western Sky Point. For a time, red, yellow, white, and black juice and powder were scattered everywhere. When the soldiers saw the tragic death of the officer, their last courage dissipated, and they immediately turned and ran away. Among the 4 regiments of American troops, soldiers from one regiment began to flee, and soon it was like a flood bursting its banks. All the soldiers were fleeing, and the officers could not stop them. The snipers and hunters on the Austrian side are not like they were on the European continent. They specialize in attacking the opponent's senior officers. Those US military officers also discovered that they were the targets of the Austrians, and they couldn't help but secretly cursed Europeans are not authentic. Nothing could be more miserable than an army retreating on the plains, while the opponent still has a large number of cavalry. The American soldiers ran around like frightened rabbits, while the Austrian soldiers continued to chase after them. At this time, the Indian cavalry, who had been waiting for a long time, rushed towards the defeated soldiers with joy. Ho! Ho ho! The Indian on the horse screamed strangely and clapped his mouth with his hands, just like a group of Tarzans. This is in line with people's stereotypes of this group of Native Americans. In fact, these Indians also feel very happy. This undoubtedly stimulates the hunting genes in their bodies. In fact, this is what Franz requested. After all, this can create the greatest pressure on people, but it was not good news for the American soldiers who were escaping. For a while, zip lines with stones tied to both sides and nooses used to corral cattle were flying all over the sky. The skills of these Indians are very good. If the flying stone rope hits the leg of the defeated soldier, he can immediately subdue the person. The person whose body is tied up with the noose is fine. If he is unfortunate enough to be tied around the neck, it depends on whether he can survive. God's will. Of course, these Indians would not deliberately kill people. After all, they needed these white slaves, and then sent them to the mining areas to mine. They could not only get the expected rewards of cash and food, but also obtain the most important certificate of good citizens. The battle ended quickly. Of the 4,000 American troops, about 600 were killed directly in the battle, and there were 700 to 800 wounded soldiers. The remaining 2,000 people were strung together with neck nooses, like 16 soldiers. century black slaves were driven to mining areas by Indians. The war dead will be buried on the spot, and the wounded will be handed over to the indigenous people for treatment. As for the weapons and trophies, the Austrian army will distribute them reasonably, and the rest will be brought back to the city. Some captured US military officers protested, but the Austrian officers did not respond. I speak German. Damn you Austrian pig. I want to see your commander, and I demand fair and reasonable treatment. Colonel Abbott roared. This attitude of the American prisoners of war frightened the Indian chiefs on the side. Austria's high-pressure rule prevented them from showing any signs of neglect. The chief immediately covered the prisoner's mouth, then pulled out his riding crop and greeted him, and finally said it twice in very stiff English and German. You are a slave of our tribe, and you are not qualified to negotiate treatment conditions. If you dare to talk to adults with this attitude again, I will cut off your tongue and let you eat it. Colonel Abbott glared at the red-skinned Indian, but chose to keep his mouth shut when he saw the belt made of human skulls. Soon the Austrians and the Indians parted ways. When Colonel Dardo saw the opportunity, he immediately said to the chief beside him, "Let us go, and we will find a reservation for your tribe in the United States. Or return the guns to us, and we will sneak attack on the Austrian cities at night. Then you can have whatever you want. How about it?" Facing the temptation of this white man, the Indian warriors on the side laughed disdainfully. The chief on the horse did not answer, but just took a sip from the hookah in his hand. Seeing that the other party made no move, Colonel Dardo felt that the price he offered was not enough, so he gritted his teeth and continued, "As long as you let us go, we can satisfy you with cigarettes, alcohol, weapons, bullets, whatever you want." The chief glanced sideways at the talkative prisoner this time, and then turned back to smoke his hookah. Colonel Dardo had a big smile on his face, but now it froze on his face. He changed his mind and said viciously again, "We are Americans. Does America know this? The largest country in the world. Austria is about the same size as our state, but now there are 27 states in the United States. If you don't let us go, you will all die." This time the chief finally stopped his horse, looked at the prisoners of war in front of him, and then took off his feather crown to reveal his severed scalp. "I trusted you and wanted to be an American citizen, and then you scalped me. But I'm not dead. Now you can choose to work for me. As long as you can dig out enough gold sand, I can satisfy you with whatever food, drink, or even women and opium you want. You can choose to believe me, or be scalped, and hang on that cliff." Chapter 508 Stealing Tactics. Colonel Dardo stared at the bones hanging on the cliff, swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and chose to retreat. After all, a good man will not suffer the consequences. Soon the white officer found his place in the mine. The amount of gold sand here is frightening. Fortunately, the Indian chief has fulfilled his promise. He can get all kinds of food, drinks, cigarettes, and even prostitutes. The disadvantages that their cooking skills are a little hard to describe, so you just need cooking utensils and ingredients to cook by yourself, just like you were in the Boy Scouts. Some US military prisoners even think that the land under their feet is a legendary promised land. After all, here you can really get rich with your own hands, and such work is so simple. In addition to the lack of freedom, it is fair, wealthy, and even eliminates status differences to a certain extent. After all, those officers have to work like ordinary soldiers to get food, and there are not only white people in the mines, but also Indians and mixed race people. It can be seen that the chief it's true that everyone is treated equally. In just a few days, some of the prisoners were tamed. They dismissed their former superiors' thoughts of escaping, and even reported on those compatriots who wanted to escape. On the other hand, the US military is still on its way. Although the craze for gold gave these cowboys superhuman perseverance and endurance, after all, not every army can reach the level of one person and two riders. In fact, the US military's marching team at this time was considered extremely wealthy by its European counterparts, because at this time, most European armies did not have many horses or donkeys, and soldiers in some areas did not even have uniform shoes. And marching can only be done on foot. The journey from Denver to California was not an easy task. First, we had to deal with the Mexicans' pursuit and defense of the fortress. Fortunately, the opponent's defense was ineffective. Not only did the Mexican army arrive late, but the subsequent battles with the US military were intermittent. They seemed to be in no hurry to cut off the Americans' retreat. Of course, this was a misjudgment and wrong strategy by the great commander Tazanana. He did not think that the enemy would choose to go deep alone. After all, the New Mexico area at this time was just a huge no man's land in our own eyes. According to Mexican statistics, there is only one person in 20 square kilometers on average, and most places are undeveloped. However, what the Mexicans did not expect was that at this time the number of American immigrants in the area exceeded the total local Mexican population. But even with the help of American immigrants, the journey of the US military was full of hardships. Mountains, grasslands, deserts, swamps, as well as tornadoes and sandstorms all threatened their lives at all times. Fortunately, they brought enough supplies and formulated a perfect plan. In fact, this US military team is not alone. There are more companions behind them setting up supply points along the way. It also includes one of the most critical strategies, which is that another US military force will support them from the sea. That's right. This is not a long distance attack without any plan, nor is it a gamble on the fate of the country. Rather, it was a careful plan. They would take a boat to Panama, then cross the Central American Isthmus, and then take a boat to sneak attack on the Austrian rear. In fact, this is what Americans have done historically, and they have won resoundingly. They chose to land in San Francisco and easily captured the California region with the help of a large number of leading parties. But now the Americans have encountered a problem, that is, the Republic of New Granada. Colombia, that rules Panama at this time, simply does not dare to let them use the passage point. On the one hand, it is connected to the Austrian colonies and is afraid of Austria's powerful force. On the other hand, there is the threat from the United Kingdom. After all, as the world's #1 troublemaker, wouldn't it be a disgrace to his reputation if he didn't get involved in this matter? In a sense, Britain does not want the United States to dominate North America. It would be best if it could be divided like the European continent. That would be in the best interests of Great Britain. It's just that now the British themselves can neither spare nor have enough energy to take care of it. But this does not prevent them from causing trouble behind the scenes, and the Republic of New Granada will naturally not cause trouble for itself. At this time, Central America was occupied by foreign powers. Britain, France, and Austria all had their own reasons for refusal. In the end, the Americans had no choice but to bypass South America and continue to march toward California. Of course, General Zachary Taylor, who was in charge of the frontal attack, did not know this. He was still advancing in leaps and bounds according to the original plan. If the general knew that his naval operations had been delayed, he would have more time to leisurely pass through those death zones, and there would be no problems such as insufficient troops, since both the United States and Mexico were on guard against a sneak attack by the French. The Texas side's mere factual reporting aroused a series of conjectures among Paris' top brass. Marshal Soult, who was looking forward to an honorable retirement, naturally tried his best to prevent France from participating in the war, while Louis-Philippe was a little suspicious and even felt that this was a trap set by the United States and Mexico for France. The other cabinet members saw that His Majesty the King and the Prime Minister had reached a consensus, so why were we joining in the fun? It's better to separate and go home to be with your wife. As a result, France's participation in the war as expected by John Taylor did not happen. At the same time, the actions of the Mexicans were also very suspicious. They did not rush to attack, but just randomly robbed the US supply convoy like a group of bandits. But one thing was within the expectations of the President of the United States, and that was that the Mexicans concentrated all their forces on the northern front. The United States and Mexico are now facing each other east and west on the Rio Grande. Both sides have assembled hundreds of thousands of troops, and a war is about to break out. But a piece of news broke the tranquility of the battlefield. The US military had captured the port of Veracruz and was heading towards Mexico City. At the same time, 15 merchant ships traveling between Mexico and Austria were seized, but it would take some time for this news to reach the Austrian mainland. But fortunately, the weapons and military personnel shipped from Austria to Mexico were already in place. coupled with the assistance of the church. What was stopped were umbrellas, troop carriers and some cargo ships carrying sugar, spices, and cotton. At this time, the United States of America had not declared war on the Austrian Empire, so of course there was nothing that could be done to these security personnel and businessmen, except to lock them up in a hotel at the port. The US military has actually made a lot of preparations for this war, and the home stealing tactic at this time is one of them. But Franz had already prepared for this. He asked Mexico to purchase a large number of old ships that had been retired by its own navy, and also built a large number of forts around several ports where it might land. But God is not as good as man, and these arrangements were of no use. Not long after the war started, the Mexican Navy Marshal made contact with the Americans and prepared to surrender. Therefore, this Mexican Navy, which was built with a lot of money, has become a boost to the US Navy. This brought the total number of ships in the US West Coast Fleet to a terrifying 113 ships at this time. Historically, there were 70 US fleets involved in attacking Mexico City. Of course, these included a large number of troop transports and cargo ships, not all warships. Chapter 509 Youthful Spirit. On the other side, in the Near East, a fleet slowly sailed into the Black Sea Strait. The young man wearing a sailing cap standing on the bow of the boat looked at the 1,000-year-old city in front of him with high spirits. He was Andrei Uvarov, the special envoy of the Tsar this time. At only 17 years old, he may be the youngest envoy in Russian history to visit a foreign country, but everyone has high expectations for him. After all, the surname Uvarov has a glorious history, and he is technically a member of the civil service. Andrei also understood the importance of the task he was tasked with at this time, and he must do everything possible to amplify things, although it seems a bit fussy to use force, because the sheep gnawed cotton. The key point is that the Ottoman sheep gnawed Russian cotton, which is very serious. Although the matter was of great importance, Andrei Uvarov did not go directly to meet Sultan Mejid, but chose to visit Constantinople. An outstanding person can always start from the inconspicuous details and see many things that others cannot see. For example, there are very few Russians in this capital, but there are many British people. Most of the shops in the former are empty, while the shops in the latter are crowded. Tsarist Russia had its own embassy here, and also owned commercial companies. Most of these companies specialize in grain, wood, fur and other specialties of their own. Although the prices are low, almost no one cares about them. Russia has its own living area in Constantinople and even its own church. But these made the young envoy frown even more. There is no doubt that Russia is an unwelcome presence in this city. Of course, the powerful Russian Empire never cares about other people's attitudes, because it will only make the world proud of it. Andrei Uvarov took off his gloves, handed them to the attendants around him, then walked to a fountain and began to wash his face with the water in it. This attracted passers-by to raise eyebrows. In fact, the Ottomans were deeply hostile to the Russians. The huge religious and cultural differences between the two amplified the already existing conflicts. The result of the above superposition is the previous Russian-Turkish wars. Russia has always been a threat to the Ottoman Empire, and everyone knows the style of the Russian army. Naturally, the latter cannot like this powerful invader, and the same is true for its people. Andrei Uvarov finished washing, but no Ottoman dared to stop him, which made him feel a little disappointed and a little proud. The young envoy boarded the carriage and drove away, leaving only a group of people pointing. Topkapi Palace, a building that combines Byzantine style, filled the young man in front of him with pride. He finally understood why every generation of Tsar wanted to take back this coveted ancient city. The mottled traces on the walls and the vicissitudes of history. This sense of historical weight really makes people full of strength. The Ottoman guards on the side were already used to it. Every big man from Europe would behave strangely, and some even hugged the wall and cried bitterly. Sultan Mejid is a representative of big thunder, but little rain in human history. His former heroic ambitions seem to have been forgotten long ago, and his body is being hollowed out by wine and sex. Rashid Pasha's economic reforms imitating France failed, and the British fully occupied the market. In addition, his successor Reza Pasha was an out-and-out villain. The newly appointed Grand Vizier used the excuse that the country was facing a threat to expand the new army. The scale of his efforts was jaw-dropping. He expanded the number of the empire's standing army by 250,000 people at once, making the number of the empire's standing army directly exceed 500,000. It even scared people. The Persian Empire next door was also expanding its army crazily. Point of course, the so-called military expansion is just a cover. In fact, it is just to get more benefits and to allow his family's brothers and sons-in-law to sit in high positions. The new military law announced during the speech at the Majid Flower Hall was also trampled by Reza Pasha. Among the recruits he recruited, there were no Christians, let alone those marginalized ethnic groups who were not welcome to see him. When speaking in the Flower Hall, Majid said that all ethnic groups should be equal. Reza Pasha had so much power that the finance minister had to consult him first before reporting to the Sultan himself. Even the British ambassador could not stand the Pasha's misappropriation of public funds and abuse of power. Stratford Canning raised the issue of the Grand Vizier's corruption with Majid on more than one occasion, but to the former's dismay the latter did not take corresponding action. Instead, he told these things to Reza Pasha. The former naturally suffered crazy revenge from this powerful minister. If it weren't for Canning's status as ambassador to the leader of the great powers, he might have been dead or hung on a tree in the desert of the Anatolian plateau. In fact, as a treacherous minister, Reza Pasha knew how to maintain a personal relationship with Majid. The former collected a large number of beauties and treasures from all over the world to cultivate the latter's sentiment, so the relationship between the monarch and his minister was indescribable. Not on point when the Sultan and the Grand Vizier learned that the Russians came because of the sheep, they couldn't help laughing. Reza Pasha even generously expressed his willingness to give the Russian envoy 100 sheep. If those Slavic barbarians don't know how to cook, we can do it for them. After all, the Ottomans have the best chefs in the world. One of Majid's favorite concubines smiled, and another also smiled. Then, our Ottoman Empire has suffered great losses, isn't it? How do you say that? The young Sultan looked at the two beauties with interest. However, he had to meet the Russian envoy from afar, but he still joked. Then, we have to add pepper. The beauty laughed so hard that her branches trembled, while Majid looked at it with joy. Suddenly a voice broke the atmosphere. The Russian envoy Prince Andrei Uvarov has an audience with the great Sultan Abdulmegid. Majid sat upright as if he wanted to put some pressure on the other party. The two concubines were also very good at observing words and expressions. They bowed their heads and prepared to leave. But at this time, the Sultan lost all the caution he had when he first took the throne. Instead, he became self-centered and even allowed two more concubines to stay and continue to serve him. It is not known where this courage came from. Maybe it was the guarantee from the British, maybe it was the 500,000 standing army, and of course maybe it was Liang Jingru. Andrei Uvarov and the Russian envoy met the Sultan and bowed respectfully. As soon as the young envoy raised his head, he saw this somewhat funny and annoying scene. A middle-aged man with a fat body and short limbs was eating grapes handed over by the concubine, while looking away with a stinky face. Andrei Uvarov suddenly felt that he and his motherland had been insulted. He took a deep breath and paused for a few seconds, then shouted when the other party was confused and prepared to ask, "I, Andrei Uvarov, by order of His Majesty the Great Tsar, have come to see the Ottoman Sultan Majid. I salute you." Majid was so startled by the sudden roar that he collapsed in the arms of the two concubines. He touched his chest and gasped. This led to the sheep-eating soil incident that historians of later generations rushed to study. Chapter 510 Sheep Eats Dirt. Andrei Uvarov's roar made the guards around the palace become nervous. Majid himself was even more frightened, but no one dared to act rashly. In fact, the Russian mission was also very frightened. They were all Nasirov's old subordinates, and their usual work was basically to follow the script, and there was no need to make any mistakes in conveying the will of His Majesty. The Tsar, the young duke, did not follow the routine when he came up. His behavior could even be called a provocation. After all, this was Ottoman territory. This roar on the other side made Majid sober up a lot. After being indulged in wine and sex all day long, he finally thought of this neighbor in the north who was eyeing him with eagerness. Seeing that the Sultan was frightened and the surrounding guards were numb and unresponsive, a concubine pointed at the Russian envoy and wanted to say something. But before she could say anything, she was slapped hard. The young concubine looked at Majid in disbelief and said aggrievedly, "I then She received another resounding slap in the face. Who asked you to speak? Get out. The two concubines could only bow with their hands crossed on their chests and then exit the palace in silence. Sudanese Majid looked at Andrei Uvarov again, and the two young men began their second round of confrontation. Thank you for your visit, Mr. Prince. I hope that the friendly relations between Russia and Turkey will last forever, and that we will have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much for your warm hospitality. We also hope that the friendship between Russia and Turkey will last forever. At the same time, we also look forward to cooperating with you and your empire to promote closer economic, political, and security relations between the two countries. I hope you can have a great afternoon. But there are a few things I hope you learn, because it could ruin this harmonious relationship. Coming from a noble family, Andrei Uvarov is naturally no stranger to this kind of diplomatic rhetoric, and as a graduate of St. Petersburg State University and the Russian Imperial Military Academy, he is not someone who is easily fooled. The other party's answer was neither humble nor arrogant, and he had already seen it clearly. Sultan Majid knew he couldn't avoid it and said it. Oh, what is it? Why didn't I know there was such a thing? Majid's attitude was within the expectations of Andrei Uvarov, who explained calmly, recently, a goat gnawed the cotton grown by our farmers near the Caucasus. Oh, what's this? Sheep eat grass and wolves eat meat. Isn't this normal? But this goat belongs to your country. Andrei Uvarov was interrupted by Majid before he finished speaking. It's just some cotton. I sympathize with the serf, and I'm willing to give him 100 kilograms of high quality cotton as a private gift. Are you satisfied with this solution? Majid wanted to cut through the mess quickly, but the other party obviously didn't want him to do so. Dear Sultan, you don't understand. It is your goats that eat the cotton grown by our farmers. Majid interrupted Andrei Uvarov again. If you have any objection to compensating cotton, then I can also make the decision to compensate another 100 goats. Is your country satisfied this time? Faced with Majid's stupid answer, Andrei Uvarov was not angry and just finished his words slowly. Dear Sultan, you don't understand. It was your goats that ate the cotton grown by our farmers, which was originally a gift to His Majesty the Tsar. Majid frowned. He did not expect that the Russian envoy, who was always stupid, would be replaced, and he did not expect that this kind of cotton near the Black Sea could be related to the Tsar. Well, in addition to the previous compensation, I will also personally select a gift for His Majesty the Tsar to send to St. Petersburg. What do you think? Majid had already given the other party enough face, but he still kept a cautious eye. He did not say what the so-called gift was, although it is a big picture. Generally speaking, diplomats from other countries can only choose to shut up at this time. However, Andrei Uvarov was the Russian special envoy. He did not ask what the so-called gift was, but he did not intend to let the other party go. Dear Sultan, the great Tsar Nicholas I once said that he was a loving father to the 30 million peasants in Russia. The gift from a son to his father cannot be replaced by any treasure. I hope you can understand this. Majid was almost speechless. He didn't expect the other party to be so shameless, so he had no choice but to say resignedly, what do you mean? It's not my intention, but His Majesty the Great Tsar proposed that, if you cannot manage the sheep on your land, we in the Russian Empire are willing to do it for you. His generous Tsar Majesty can help you manage the country, and after we take over the province of Kars, we will pay you taxes, based on the average tax for the past 10 years. Andrei Uvarov spoke slowly, but Majid was sweating. The so-called Kars province, located near the Black Sea and bordering the Russian and Persian empires, was an important buffer zone on the Ottoman Empire's eastern frontier. The Kars province at that time actually included the modern Turkish provinces of Altay, Adarkhan, Kars, and the southwestern region of Georgia, with a total area of approximately 21,000 square kilometers. Slightly smaller than the area of 23,000 square kilometers of the Lombardy province in the northern Italian region of the Austrian Empire. Majid cannot accept this kind of thing. He does not want to cede land and pay compensation like his ancestors. What's more, Russia is a greedy beast with an endless appetite. A moment of weakness will only lead to endless bullying point, but Majid knew very well that his army of 500,000 people was simply unable to stop this powerful enemy. He needed allies. Although the British gave the Ottoman Empire a lot of help, they often asked for more. This approach was tantamount to drinking poison to quench thirst point. Although the French have been showing goodwill to the Ottoman Empire, without the Turkish-Egyptian War, Majid's father would not have died, and the country would not have declined to this point. And the culprit of all this was the French point. The most important thing is that the French have never been soft when it comes to grabbing territory. A large area of Algeria that once belonged to the Ottoman Empire is being ravaged by their iron hoof point. In fact, the French massacre of local Arabs and religions has aroused dissatisfaction on the Ottoman side, but they did not dare to express it due to national strength point. As for the Austrians, although they have little interest in the territory and market of the Ottoman Empire on the surface, they are allies of the Russians after all. And they cannot gain the trust of Majid. Moreover, the Austrians attacked the Egyptian navy and captured Ottoman ships among the warships, but they refused to return them, even if the United Kingdom came forward. Coupled with the fact that the Ottoman Empire besieged Vienna twice in history, the feud between the two sides had long been forged. Although Majid could not think of a way for the time being, he would not directly agree to such a treaty that would be humiliating the country. It's still the old method of dragging. Majid feels that the great powers definitely don't want to see Russia dominate the Near East, and they will definitely intervene to mediate. Chapter 511 Sorrow. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. To be honest, Franz felt a little helpless for the first time at this time. A large amount of scattered information was gathered from all directions, but more than the explosive amount of information, what makes Franz more helpless is that this information may be out of date before it reaches Vienna. In the era without instant messaging, it was simply impossible to micromanage everything. All he can do now is trust the people here and the strategies he formulated before. Fortunately, the Austrian Empire has no problems in the general direction at this time. Regarding the Nanyang issue, although it is outrageous to say that King pirates traveled thousands of miles to attack the British and Dutch fleets, it was in the interests of the British Empire. As for the Dutch, they avenged one stone, while the Austrian side avoided war and successfully squeezed out the British. In contrast, the so-called truth no longer seems important here. However, Nanming's actions still made Franz very angry. It was obvious that the woman did not know her position yet. For this emerging country, this kind of military adventure was completely worth the loss. This kind of small country is too small to get anything even if it wins, but if it loses it will be a disaster. Of course, Franz was fortunate that the worst situation did not happen. In East Africa, the rebellion started by that idiot Governor Benny Urban and his brother made Franz feel incredible. He really didn't understand how flying dragon riding face could lose. It could be said that Franz had handed over all power to the governor of Tanzania. All he wanted was a stable trade route. The brothers ended up fighting, and Franz would not believe Benny Urban's argument that he was innocent. The reason for brotherly hostility is mostly due to the uneven distribution of interests, and this is probably the case with the sudden changes in East Africa. In fact, Franz had expected that the rebellion would occur, but he did not expect that it would appear in this situation. After being attacked by Friedrich, Tanzania no longer has a force that it is so powerful that it can suppress all the local snakes. Leaderlessness would inevitably lead to unrest, and the cost of direct Austrian rule was too high. Franz has been waiting recently for a certain local family or force to offer to serve the Austrian Empire. As for Benny Urban's actions, he can't be wrong. He is nothing without the support of his family, but he is nothing if he loses it. Now, unless Benny Urban can find a way to suppress other forces in Tanzania again, his career as governor and his life will come to an end. But it is not that there is no good news. For example, Franz's uncle, Archduke Friedrich, seems to have a very high opinion of the young princess of the said dynasty. Sneaker. This is in line with Austria's interests. Although the strength of the Ottoman Empire is not enough to be seen in Europe, and it may not even be considered the second strongest, it is indeed unique in East Africa and West Asia. Marriage with the Ottoman Empire is definitely a decision where the pros outweigh the cons. It will help ensure the smooth flow of the Indian Ocean shipping lanes, and will become increasingly important in the future. Highlight the emphasis, and guess the reason. Although Franz is in favor of it, the Habsburg family and the church may not agree with this marriage point. Religious issues, as well as some historical and ethnic issues, will create great resistance to this marriage point. After all, Friedrich was not a motley Grand Duke like Ambrosius, and his marriage could not be decided hastily. However, this marriage is a very good choice for him personally. His family, and the country. Genetically speaking, mixed-race children will have more advantages, based on various factors, and they can also avoid the disadvantages of incest marriage among European royal families to a certain extent. The decline of the Habsburg family is inseparable from genetic degradation, otherwise it would not have transformed from the world's first empire on which the sun never sets to the later Doll Empire. In the era before Queen Issa, Austrian citizens were even worried about the continuation of the Habsburg family. Fortunately, Her Majesty the Queen is very fertile, and the royal family has reached its current size, but Franz understands that it will not be long before this ancient family will once again be in crisis of heirs. Moreover, historically Friedrich and his brother did not leave any heirs, which can't help but make people feel a little sad. After all, Archduke Karol left a huge fortune. As for the national level, an alliance with the Ottoman Empire is beneficial to both parties, so I won't go into details here. After several slash and burn colonies in West Africa, the indigenous people became much quieter, and some tribes even worshipped the Austrians as gods, but Franz knew very well that this was only a temporary peace. After all, the traces left by the fire would be erased by time, the weeds would sprout again, and the war would not leave this land easily. The entire West Africa was rapidly entering a semi-feudal and semi-slavery society under Franz's control. A large number of manors were established. The endless work of slaves and the unearned gains of the manor owners separated the entire society. At this time, it is time for religion to play a role. In fact, if you want stability, it is better to use the Hindu caste system, but Austria is a Catholic country after all, and the power of the church is too strong. Letting the church preach and free slaves was its bottom line, but at Franz's strong request, some additional conditions were added, such as trials of faith. The so-called faith trials are actually similar to the 8 major tortures of the Manchu Qing dynasty. Their purpose is to test whether those people sincerely convert to the church. And even if he passed the test, he would just work as a laborer in the Austrian manor, although it is theoretically not impossible for black people to obtain the status of imperial citizens and even become prime minister one day. In fact, the difficulty is about the same as the probability of winning the grand prize of 20 lottery draws in a row. After all, Franz did not want this group of magicians to touch the interests of the local upper class. Although it was easy for Austria to raise those tribes at this time, this method was not advisable for the development speed and long-term stability of the colony. Then 2 major events happened in the world at this time: the US-Mexican War and the Second Near East Crisis. The former directly threatened Austria's interests, while the latter threatened the future of the Austrian Empire. The US-Mexico War was a contest of great disparity in power. The United States had 3 times the population of Mexico, and the former was very cunning and blocked the latter's ports. As soon as the war began, this has caused the morale of the Mexican army to plummet, and without the support of Austria, Tazzanana's control over his country will decline rapidly. Judging from the experience of later generations, the Americans will most likely support a puppet to come to power. Once Tazzanana loses power, the so-called new government will tear up the agreement with Austria. That kind of result is what Franz least wants to see, so Tazzanana cannot be defeated. But the problem came again. The empire had no troops to send at this time, and only a small number of colonial troops could go to support it. The most important thing is that the French have not taken action, yet. Chapter 512 Make a fortune by making a sound. The French had not yet made any move, but the British could not sit still. That's right, France, the authority, didn't even take a stand, and England started jumping up and down. The British media and their politicians clearly oppose the unabashed behavior of the United States on the other side of the ocean, that intensifies conflicts and provokes wars, especially the latter's actions of blocking the coastline and detaining other countries' ships. This is simply a serious violation of the free trade order and rite of passage challenge. Ironically, British businessmen with flexible moral bottom line sold boxes of arms to the west coast of the United States as usual, and the quantity even increased. It was also true that Robert Peel hoped that Austria and France would join the war, and British diplomats spared no effort to promote the American threat, even suggesting that they could even provide fleet escort if Austria was willing to send troops. Of course, whether it can arrive safely is another matter. After all, Britain has no reason to go to war with the United States at this time, right? The French were indifferent and showed no interest in the British proposals. After all, the attitude of the top management is there, who wants to meddle in other people's business, but the more France adopts this attitude, the less senior leaders of other powers dare to despise it, which naturally includes France. After all, the size is there, coupled with the important geographical location, it can turn the battle situation around at any time, as long as it sends troops before the situation is clear. France declares its position. It is impossible for Austria to make any big moves. No matter how important the colony was, it was not as important as the security of the homeland, not to mention that France didn't want to take risks. However, Prince Metternich was once again tempted by the British proposal. This was mainly because Count Latter, a landlubber, clamored all day long to easily defeat the American army. After all, the Austrian army today is much stronger than it was in history. Sufficient military spending allows military personnel to have ample time for high quality training, and at the same time, accelerates the upgrading of weapons, making weapons more abundant. The most obvious example is that at this time in history, Austrian soldiers only had 5 opportunities to fire live ammunition every year, and the rest of their training relied on thought shooting. Naturally, it is impossible to train any elite soldiers with this method. However, due to the development of technology and the problem of overcapacity, the number of live ammunition fired by Austrian soldiers has reached 70 rounds per year, which is 14 times that of the same period in history. In fact, in terms of the production speed of bullets alone, the sum of the 3 arsenals that the Tsar was obsessed with could not reach the output of one arsenal of Fizz, a prosperous Western ally that could operate at full capacity for a month. Because at this time, the 3 major arsenals in Russia were still characterized as 3 relatively large handmade workshops. Although the scale was not small, the technology had not made significant progress, and they still use the old model from the Napoleonic War, coupled with the fact that some corrupt officials are unwilling to pay high prices to hire skilled workers. The quality of the bullets produced is not only uneven, but the output is also frighteningly low. 10 rounds a day is not bad. In fact, skilled workers who have achieved popularization can make a bullet in 5 to 10 minutes, and hundreds of bullets can be produced in a day. With the help of machinery, female workers in Austria can do what a skilled worker does in a day in half a day, and even faster, if necessary. Various other combat weapons also greatly strengthened the confidence of Latter, the Minister of War. However, sometimes wars are not about who can fight better, but who consumes more energy. And the transoceanic expedition was still too early for this country. Of course, Franz would not really choose to sit back and die. As early as the early days of the war, he had already sent people to the United States to find allies. After all, war is not just about who can fight better. At the same time, what happened in the Near East also caught Franz off guard. He never expected that the Tsar's ambition would expand so quickly. Although Russia is only asking for a small piece of land this time, the reality is that if they gain a foothold south of the Caucasus, no one will be able to stop this behemoth from expanding in West Asia. Although the Ottomans and Prussia are also hegemons in their respective regions, they are still too weak compared to the Russian Empire, not to mention that these 2 countries have not dealt with each other. The Ottomans' attitude was obviously not firm enough, and the British did not show a strong will at this time. There is no doubt that it is very uncomfortable to use their brains to guess the other side's next strategy. Of course, this is not without basis for judgment. At least from the perspective of national interests, it is impossible for the British to allow the expansion of their opponent, the Russians. However, the problems faced by Robert Peel at this time involved a lot of the Prime Minister's energy, not to mention that in his heart he hoped that Mao Zedong's reckless behavior would make Austria and Russia go against each other. After all, in theory, Russia and Austria are in the Near East competitors. However, there is a small problem with this logic. That is, Russia is asking for land near the Caucasus at this time, while Austria's traditional strategic goal is to seize the Balkans. The two goals are far apart. This move does not necessarily affect the latter's strategic interests. But in fact, although Kars province is thousands of miles away from Austria, Russia's uncontrolled expansion will affect the judgment of the Ottomans, and thus undermine Franz's layout. Collapse is inevitable. It depends on how much benefit each of the great powers can share, or external interference turns the Ottoman legacy into a pile of reply point. But the morning and evening of this time are very important. For Austria, if you eat too early, you won't be able to eat. If you don't eat well late, you will suffer from indigestion. At this time, Russia's actions are undoubtedly accelerating the process, which is not what Franz wants to see. But from another perspective, Austria is an ally of Russia, and Nicholas I is not a fool. St. Petersburg will definitely ask Vienna for its opinion before taking action. This issue was once again thrown to Austria. Supporting Russia would offend Britain and the Ottomans, and it was also not in line with the country's interests in the Balkans. If you choose not to support it, then all the previous efforts made by Franz will be in vain. Tsarist Russia will become his biggest threat in the East, and he will be isolated diplomatically again. In the future, actions in overseas and European continents must be cautious, otherwise it is possible that they will be targeted by the great powers at any time. At the same time, Germany and Italy will no longer be the back gardens of the empire, where the great powers will cultivate their own agents to weaken Austria's power and prevent it from expanding its territory. Sardinia and Prussia will receive strong support, and even the great powers will directly step in to help them when they fight with Austria. Then the Vienna court had to make peace with Hungary and local powerful factions in order to stabilize its rule. The country would further regress and eventually become the so-called Dull Empire. Franz naturally would not tolerate this unfavorable situation to happen again, and of course he would not allow the furry bear to continue to expand. Robert Peel was also troubled by the incident of sheep eating dirt in the Near East and couldn't sleep. He really couldn't understand why the Russians did this. Stratford Canning informed London of Russia's actions as soon as possible, so the British Prime Minister received intelligence about the Near East earlier than France. First of all, it is impossible for the United Kingdom to sit idly by and ignore the unbridled expansion of the Russian Empire. However, not to mention its internal and external difficulties at this time, and the entire world is experiencing frequent problems. Even the world's most powerful country lacks the motivation to get involved in a new dispute. So Robert Peel thought of a way. Yes, kick the ball to the Austrians. After all, he knows very well that there can only be one overlord in Eastern Europe, and no matter which country loses, it is good news for Britain. Compared with the Mexican-American War and the Second Near East Crisis, future famine on the island of Ireland and the civil war that may break out at any time in Switzerland are less important. Ireland, south in a small town near Queen Village, crowds gathered in the center of the square. Flags and slogans were everywhere, trumpets and drums were heard, and it was a noisy scene. It's so lively. Should we go and see it? As a country girl, Scathach Jennings had a rare opportunity to come to the town to play. It was the first time she saw so many people present, so she turned to ask her eldest brother Patrit. No, Patrit said decisively, and shook off his sister's hand. If you don't go, you won't go. What's wrong? Scathach Jennings has also reached the age of rebelliousness, especially since her brother failed to do the thing before, but she succeeded, so she began to have a little temper. Patrit hit his sister on the head, and the latter could only look at the former in pain. Just wait, I'll go back and tell Dad. Listen, Scathach, my sister. Do you know what day it is? Patrit said patiently. How do I know? My memory is not extraordinary. Scathach Jennings rubbed his red forehead aggrievedly. Today is July 12th, the so-called glorious 12th day by the British. They defeated us at the Battle of the Boyne River and brutally massacred those warriors who refused to surrender, Patrit said, looking at Scathach. But those people celebrating are obviously Irish? Scathach asked with confusion. Yes, those people are Protestants, and most of them are the lackeys of the English masters. Naturally, they have to celebrate their master's victory, even if it is paid for with the blood of their own compatriots. See the red cloaks on those people. It's all dyed red with the blood of us Irish. The more Patrick spoke, the more indignant he became. After all, this kind of education was often given in the restoration organization he joined, and his eyes even started to sparkle. But his sister showed a look of disdain. After all, she received the Austrian education in the church every day. The Austrian education of this period advocated science and rationality. Who did this? The answer is Joseph II, one of the few New Deal measures to survive. Although rationality and science are both praiseworthy words in modern times, under the wrong people and wrong interpretation, some strange results will always occur. Yes, one of them is contempt for humanity. Brother, you lie. What do you mean? This meaningless sentence made Patrick faint. Father, Hans said that when blood dries, it will scab and become darker, mainly brownish red and black. Scathach Jennings retorted confidently. Patrick was silent for a while, and then grabbed his sister's two pigtails, and started firing wildly. You are so stupid from reading. I'm sensationalizing. Do you understand? You are also Irish and Catholic. If you had appeared on the Boyne River at that time, they would have hanged you too. After a while, the brother and sister left the town. Scathach was arranging her messed up hair and holding a bag of salt in her arms. She was holding her chest, as if there was a baby in her arms. This was her home. Take this season with a pinch of salt. Patrick was carrying 3 shovels. Brand new shovels seemed a bit luxurious for ordinary farmers, but in fact they were bought for the priests in the church. These new priests always like to dig endlessly under the church. They don't know what they are looking for, or they want to dig a tunnel straight into the ground. Later, when the villagers heard that Austria was on the other side of the world, they were relieved and thought that these priests might be homesick. Since the priests would put the use tools in the open space outside the church, it was inevitable that they would be lost. Some families who lack farm tools will take them home secretly at night. The church will not trace the whereabouts of these tools. Of course, occasionally someone will return them, and the priest will not make any announcement either. However, people's lives have not been easy recently, and too many tools from the church were lost, so they had to entrust the Jennings brothers, who were going to the town to buy salt, to buy some shovels. Although these priests were also gringos, Patrick didn't have a bad impression of them, so he accepted the task. The 2 of them were on tenterhooks all the way back, fearing that someone would try to steal the shovels. Fortunately, the big robber who robbed the shovels did not appear. On the contrary, when the 2 of them were passing by a small river, they discovered a school of salmon. The brother and sister took a shovel and poked in the river and caught several salmon. There are only 5 salmon. What should I do? Isn't that enough? Patrick said in embarrassment. Yes. What should Dad, Mom, Tommy, Mickey, Erin, Nina, you and me do? Scathach also began to feel embarrassed. After all, it was difficult to solve this problem with her math level. The problem of dividing fish by species. I have a proposal, her brother said with a wicked smile. What proposal? 8 people, 5 fish. The heads, bodies, and tails of the fish are all different. Even if we catch 3 more fish, the sizes will be different. Scathach was struggling to use the knowledge she had learned to try to solve the problem in front of her. Question. How about we each grill 1 and eat it, and then take the remaining 3 fish back and make them into fish soup for everyone to drink? Good idea. Scathach felt that her eldest brother was really a genius, but she always felt that there was something weird about it. But anyway, she was very happy to eat grilled fish, and she happened to still have salt on her body. Only then did Scathach remember that she was still carrying salt. When she encountered a school of salmon, she rushed faster than anyone else with a shovel. Scathach hurriedly took out the package and checked it. You must know that this is the salt of their family for 4 months. If it melted in the river, her parents would probably open her buttocks. Fortunately, that did not happen. The attentive clerk wrapped a layer of oil paper inside. The brother and sister lit a fire by the river, and soon the 2 grilled fishes smelled sizzling. They returned home after feasting. When the younger brothers and sisters saw the salmon, they all shouted excitedly, because Irish people rarely eat meat on weekdays, let alone high-end products like salmon. The two mothers were shocked when they turned around, not because of the salmon, but because of their faces. What's going on with the salmon? We caught it in the river. You can make fish soup. The whole family can drink it. Looking at the two proud mothers, they shook their heads helplessly and asked symbolically, "You didn't eat it secretly, did you?" Of course not. Absolutely not. At this time, 4 children gathered around, smelling the aroma of grilled fish. "It smells so good. It's grilled fish." Mickey, who was missing his upper front teeth, and Tommy, who was missing his lower front teeth, said in unison. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 513, Turning Against Guests. Both Britain and Russia intend to kick the ball to Austria to test its attitude towards the Near East issue. However, Franz did not intend to do what they wanted, so he made a special trip to visit Metternich. It is difficult for a busy person like His Excellency the Prince to reach the top of the world for ordinary subjects and low-level officials of the empire. Even if the wealthy businessmen are powerful, as long as they are not at the level of Rothschild, if they want to meet the Prime Minister, they will basically have to start with years. After all, the Prime Minister's appointment has been scheduled for 2 years, but it is not a problem for the Royal Prince. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Franz got straight to the point. "Your Excellency, I think you should convene an international conference to discuss the current situation with the great powers." His response to Britain and France's kick was to kick it back, which would also enhance the empire's influence. Because being the convener and host of such an international conference is very beneficial to a country's international prestige and influence. By analogy, if a country originally called on all countries to discuss important matters together, but was let go midway, its reputation would also suffer a great decline. For example, in the previous London conference, all 4 parties including Austria, France, Russia, and France were absent for their own reasons. In the end, the isolated British could only force a bunch of small countries to enjoy themselves there, and they had to make a fool of themselves. But this time, Vienna was not afraid of threats and retaliation from London. After all, both Britain and Russia were begging it at this time, and Prussia, which had suffered in 2 consecutive crises, did not dare to confront it head on. Therefore, instead of waiting for others to die, it is better to take the initiative and at least seize the immediate benefits first. Fame is illusory, indispensable for some countries, but for the ancient Empire of Austria, it is a vital link, because it is one of the links that maintains this country. Metternich was essentially a person who paid great attention to national prestige. However, he had been influenced by other powers, mainly Britain, in a series of previous confrontations, and he felt that actual interests should come first, so he was full of ambitions at this time. Asked questioningly, "Your Highness, you must know very well that at this time, Britain, Russia, and even France and Prussia are waiting for our reply, or preparing to laugh at our jokes. Wouldn't it be inappropriate if we take the initiative to take over the Near East issue now? Moreover, the US-Mexico war on the other side of the ocean has endangered our country's vital interests. You should know that the Austrian-Mexican Joint Development Company turns over more than 50 million florins in profits to the state treasury every year. You must know that Mexico's total annual fiscal revenue at this time was only 40 million pesos, approximately 88 million florins. 50 million florins was equivalent to 10% of Austria's fiscal revenue at this time, which was almost twice that of the Kingdom of Hungary, equivalent to the revenue of Lombardy, slightly lower than that of Venetia, and approximately equal to 1/2 a Bohemia. It is obvious that the Prime Minister's actual thoughts are not consistent with what he usually advocates on stage. He attaches great importance to the benefits of this overseas enclave. In addition, let's talk about why the OMM Joint Development Company was able to pay an additional 50 million florins to Vienna, after paying 70% of its net income to the Mexican government. because at this time Mexico actually owed Austria hundreds of millions of florins in foreign debt, and this number was still rising. Otherwise, why would the Mexicans have been waging civil war for years? Where did the luxurious life of Tazanana and his cronies come from? How did they build the largest opera house in the world? Although the empire sacrificed a lot of profits, it actually still made some money, not to mention the gold mines in California. But for Austria at this time, a transoceanic war was still too far away, and doing so when the attitudes of the great powers were unclear was tantamount to seeking death. Even if it was endorsed by the great powers, the risks and costs would be too uneconomical. Although Mexico is important to the development of today's empire, it can only be temporarily set aside. If you bite off more than you can chew, once you get involved in North American affairs, you will be giving your own leverage to the enemy. Your Excellency, we cannot expose our weaknesses to the enemy. We must believe that justice will prevail. Faced with Franz's words, Metternich was a little confused. Although the United States was the invader, they claimed that they were the righteous party, while Tazanana was the evil tyrant. It was the Mexicans who asked the Americans to come liberate them. However, these propagandas are just the opposite in Europe. Tazanana is a civilized man, while the United States is a representative of barbarism and backwardness. This is a barbaric war that tramples on civilization. Good night, Vienna. But as the Prime Minister of the Austrian Empire and a true insider, Metternich actually knew that neither party was as civilized as they advertised, so he asked, but who is the just party? Of course it's the party with more money and greater caliber. Franz replied without thinking. Metternich felt very speechless. Is this the born saint that the Archbishop talked about? Why does it feel like the conscience is darker than those black-hearted businessmen? But after he thought about it carefully, it seemed to make sense. Austria's opposition to foreign policy soon bore fruit. Although the troublemaker Palmerston wanted to stir up trouble, he still voted in favor of Britain's participation in the Congress of Vienna. So Nicholas I was also interested in testing the tone of this Western ally. After all, the Balkans represented Austria's traditional strategic direction. Although Austria seemed to have little interest in it at this time, everything still remained superficial and did not touch on the fundamentals. Prussia's response was indeed not unexpected. Their poor performance in the previous two crises caused its status in the German Confederation to plummet. At this time, I naturally did not dare to go against my powerful neighbor in the south, so I readily agreed. Louis Philippe himself was not very interested in the crisis in the Near East, but the Church and French officials with a little strategic vision strongly expressed their willingness to participate in this conference. After all, the Ottoman legacy will affect the pattern of world power, at least in the Near East. In fact, Algeria, now occupied by France itself, belongs to Ottoman territory, and the strength of Russia is a threat to the entire Europe. Therefore, representatives of the major European powers will rush to Vienna to attend this upcoming international conference. The purpose is naturally to deal with the issue of the second Near East crisis. Sheep-eating soil. As the great powers set their sights on Vienna, a conspiracy was brewing in the mountains of Switzerland. Ticino Canton is located in the southernmost part of Switzerland and borders Sardinia and Austrian northern Italy. It is the only channel for the Orthodox Alliance to communicate with the outside world. It also shoulders the important task of transporting supplies to other Orthodox Alliance regions. Historically, it was not without reason that the Swiss Protestant League, the liberals at this time, could completely defeat the Catholic League, the Orthodox. At least in terms of talent, it was a completely crushing victory. The leader of the liberals, Joseph Loy, spent only 130,000 francs to bribe the governor of Ticino and persuaded him to appoint the liberal General Malo Condor as the commander of the garrison of Ticino. Go to the next city first. Chapter 514. Trapped in a cocoon. Across the ocean, Washington. A ray of sunlight shines directly on the desk of the owner of the White House through the window. The 10th President of the United States sits quietly at the desk. The desk in front of him is filled with documents marked an eye-catching red. John Taylor is no longer young, as evidenced by his white hair and deep wrinkles on his face. The outbreak of the US-Mexican War even caused him to neglect his newlywed wife. Fortunately, his beloved wife came to visit him every night. Although the mental pressure was relieved, He often felt that his body was hollowed out. Point back to the main story. The development of the war so far is still in the plan. The northern and southern fronts are advancing smoothly. The Mexicans were beaten to the point of abandoning their armor. They could not look at each other. Several attacks they launched were repelled by the US military. Now I can only stay in the fortress. In particular, the US military on the southern front not only controlled the coastline, but also effortlessly obtained the navy built by the Mexicans with a lot of money. Once Mexico's maritime supply lines were interrupted, it would be completely unable to confront the United States with its own strength. Although this offended the Austrian Empire, it also basically cut off its possibility of assisting Mexico. Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, commander of the 2nd U.S. Expeditionary Force in Mexico, easily captured Veracruz, port city, and discovered a large amount of supplies at the port, which to a certain extent will ease the logistical pressure on our own troops. After all, he has an army of 50,000 at this time, but the 50,000 Expeditionary Force is still at a disadvantage facing the 100,000 Mexican troops left behind. However, the commander is not worried at all, because the demographic advantage of the United States is now emerging. There were only 130,000 federal troops before the war began, but by this time it had swelled to 230,000, and this number would continue to increase as time went by. You must know that the United States at this time had a population of more than 20 million, and there were countless poor people who could not survive, cowboys and homeless people who were not afraid of death. In addition, John Tyler's mobilization limit for these generals to promote the United States could reach 100,000 people. Of course, what really gives it peace of mind is not the arrival of reinforcement, but the careful layout of the United States over the years. First, separatist forces in southern Mexico will launch a rebellion. At the same time, Mexican political opponents Joaquin de Herrera and General José Abdelka declared Tazanana treason, and the former proclaimed himself the new president in St. Louis City. Of course, this is all a trick of the Americans. Joaquin de Herrera and José Abdelka are basically the puppets of the former. Their purpose is to attack Mexico, and also to silence the great powers. Although this move was despicable and shameless, it was directly effective. More than half of the 100,000 defenders Tazanana left at home rebelled in an instant. He also tried several times to attack the Rio Grande fortress, but they all ended in failure. At this time, his retreat was cut off, and he was in a desperate situation. He is now faced with a difficult choice, that is, Mexico City is in danger. If he does not return support, once the opponent takes the capital, it will directly cause the war situation to take a turn for the worse. The soldiers will have no fighting spirit, and will have no fighting spirit because many of their family members still remain over there. In fact, this was originally because Tazanana wanted to bring his brothers to enjoy the happiness together, and at the same time, it was also a method he came up with to gain a firmer grip on his troops. But at this time, it became his life-threatening talisman. Returning aid will also cause a lot of trouble, and may even become Mexico's eternal sinner. Because at this time Tazanana's main force was still in the Albuquerque fortress, which could also serve as a deterrent to the French and Americans. But once these soldiers leave, will the enemy take advantage of the situation and seize these territories that belong to their own country? Will he take advantage of the victory and pursue it? The future is uncertain. Tazanana is still waiting for news, but the waiting will be extremely difficult. In fact, France's intelligence department is not weak, so they learned about the fire in Mexico's rear very early. A guy like Gizzard who exploited every opportunity would naturally not let go of such a good opportunity. He was so excited that he immediately called the generals of the Texas colony to discuss how to quickly seize Mexican territory. At the same time, they also asked Paris for help, hoping that Louis Philippe could change his opinion, approve the war plan, and send some reinforcement. But the Mexican standstill made France suspicious. What made it even more confused was that there was suddenly no movement from the United States. This is even more strange. At this time, the French even began to wonder whether the Americans were trying to attack from behind, so the plan to attack the Albuquerque fortress could only be pushed forward again and again. Fort Albuquerque was the largest fortress in northern Mexico at this time. It guarded the two largest shipping routes. Once it fell, the enemy could move down the river and take over a large area of southern New Mexico. now Arizona and New Mexico in the United States. In fact, it was not that the unwilling American adventurers did not want to cause trouble, but that yellow fever was rampant in the Rio Grande military camp. With an extreme lack of doctors, medicines, and mosquito nets, the sick soldiers could only wait to die. The entire camp was full of a pessimistic atmosphere. Coupled with the atrocities committed by the US military against Mexican villages and towns in the early days of the war, such as massacring villages, genocide, burning churches, and doing dirty things under holy statues. Some Mexicans at that time cursed them for a good death. Some sick soldiers thought of the enemy's curse when they were about to die, and they began to talk nonsense along with high fever. As a result, voodoo legends about the Indians spread in the military camp. It is well known that ignorance and fear are the breeding grounds of superstition. The general low cultural quality of these Americans, coupled with the extremely high mortality rate of yellow fever, made the US soldiers so convinced of the rumors of Indian voodoo that they burned everything related to the Indians nearby and pray every day hoping that he can go home safely. Seeing the crazy state of the soldiers, the officers naturally could not turn a blind eye, and some people stepped forward to stop this ridiculous behavior. But within a few days, the officers who walked out of the barracks to drive the soldiers fell ill. Now the top brass, including General Zachary Taylor, commander of the US 3rd Army, stopped chanting. The US 1st Army, which was responsible for attacking California, suffered huge losses. They never expected that the leading troops would be wiped out, let alone that the Austrians would take the initiative to attack. It was obvious that these elite US troops were exhausted after traveling long distances. Even many of the pack horses they brought were exhausted, and subsequent supplies were intermittent. In the early days of the war, the Mexican army's harassment of the US logistics supply troops had a certain effect. The actual strength of the US 1st Army should be 50,000, but due to empty pay and losses at the vanguard and on the road, there were still more than 30,000 left at this time. According to intelligence, the total strength of the Austrian Empire in California is about 10,000. So at this time the commander of the 1st Army, Stephen Kearny, did not believe that it had the ability to launch a large-scale surprise attack on his own troops. However, he still felt a little uneasy after not receiving any news from the vanguard, so he sent another 10,000 troops as an outpost, and all of this was seen by the Austrian scouts. Chapter 515. Welcome to California. When you think of the Sunshine State, California, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Sun, beach, beauties, bikini, Hollywood, or beef noodles? Of course, the impression of California at this time was still far from that of later generations. What is now displayed in front of the world is its other side, the cruelty of nature. The desert valley floor known as Death Valley is the lowest and driest region on the North American continent. It is also the only way to the future Sunshine State. Death Valley, as its name suggests, is very unfriendly to life. It is shrouded in heat and dryness. The average temperature in summer is above 38 degrees, and the highest temperature can even exceed 56 degrees. About 400,000 gold diggers once crossed this death zone without hesitation in order to reach their destination faster. At least 4% of them never made it out alive, so travelers at the time also called it this death zone. Funeral Hill. Today's US military relies on more adequate preparations and better quality than future gold diggers. Therefore, its 1st Army only lost a few hundred people when it crossed Death Valley, but the huge mental pressure and exhaustion caused by crossing this dangerous terrain. But it is difficult to eliminate. Lieutenant General Stephen Kearny had been preparing for a possible surprise attack by the Austrians. However, the expected encounter did not happen. In fact, this was because the Austrian garrison was too far away from here, and the local climate was not only torture for oneself, but also for the enemy. There is a huge temperature difference between day and night in Death Valley. During the day it is often hot enough to dry people out, but at night it is so cold that frost can form on the rocks. Therefore, you need to bring a lot of luggage when you go to ambush there, otherwise the enemy will be killed before you can. nature eliminated point. In addition, the most important point is that the uninhabited terrain is not suitable for an ambush. The narrowest part of the 225-kilometer long passage is nearly 6 kilometers wide, and the widest part can even reach 26 kilometers. The terrain is generally there are many lower salt flats and sand dunes. This terrain treats both sides equally and makes no difference. The complex terrain would hinder the Austrian army's superior firepower, so Archduke Karl Ferdinand chose to wait for work points due to his family background. He has been studying defensive warfare skills, but when he learned that the US military on the opposite side actually chose to split up his forces, he decisively decided to take the initiative. Stephen Kearny divided his 30,000-man team into two parts. He assigned most of the cavalry and light infantry, similar to the Austrian chasseurs, to Major Carter, who would be responsible for opening the way forward. At the same time, in order to find out the fate of the leading brothers' troops, the remaining infantry and baggage teams were led by himself to hold the battle at the back point. Although Major General Carter's army only has 8,000 men, its advantage lies in its high mobility and strong combat effectiveness. It can be used as an outpost for reconnaissance work. If traces of the leading friendly forces are found, on-site support can be provided, and even if they are ambushed, they can retreat in time. The reason why the large force led by Lieutenant General Stephen Kearny chose to slow down the march was because the soldiers' physical and mental limits had been reached by the previous forced march. The Austrian side learned from the mouths of the previous American prisoners that all the enemy's subsequent troop strength, firepower configuration, and personnel arrangements. In fact, it was not difficult to obtain this information. After those pampered US military officers worked in the mine for a few days, they were willing to tell them everything when asked again, keeping almost no secrets. As night fell, Lieutenant General Stephen Kearny lay down early. Many days of rapid marching had made the commander exhausted. Moreover, there was another unit in front of him as a target. Gradually, his tense nerves relaxed. After coming down, strong sleepiness also came, and soon the sound of snoring came from the tent. The soldiers outside the tent also stretched out and fell asleep holding their guns. The sentries sat on the roof of the caravan and looked up at the stars in boredom. The comrades beside the campfire did not enjoy the treatment of a tent, only a simple blanket and a quilt made of linen, but this did not prevent them from enjoying the warm stove and delicious food in their dreams. The US Army's military discipline at that time was very lax. They did not even build a sentry tower outside the camp. Instead, they chose to drive the caravan out and let the sentry sit on the roof to observe. The advantage of this method is that it saves trouble, but the disadvantage is that it is basically useless. A US military sentry spotted a group of people and even a caravan far away, but instead of reacting, he waved the light in his hand in the night. The other party also shook his head in the same way. Since the code was correct, he turned his head and continued counting stars. On the other side of the dark night, the convoy began to unload the cargo and set up the launcher. At the same time, the elite hunters spread out, and one of the small groups approached the sentry point facing an enemy force that may exceed 20,000 people. The total number of the Austrian sneak attack team did not exceed 1,000, but do not underestimate them. After all, this team brought a dozen carriages filled with rockets. As a sharp whistle sounded, the sentries in the US military camp looked around for the source of the sound. Suddenly a soldier pointed to the sky and shouted, "Look! It's a meteor. It's flying towards us." Then, there was a loud boom, and the rocket exploded above the camp, bursting into brilliant and deadly fireworks. At this time, the rockets used to attack the US military camps were not the latest rockets, but the inventory was mixed with various types and models of rockets, so the contents were naturally different. Along with the beautiful fireworks display, various debris, kerosene, combustibles, and small steel balls were scattered in all directions. Of course, there are also high explosive rockets specially used for siege. They were seen rushing into the opponent's camp. Just when the enemy nearby thought it was a stink bomb, a violent explosion suddenly occurred. The air wave was enough to lift the enemy soldiers away. The rockets in the sky were thrown at them as if they were free, causing the American officers and soldiers in the camp to wander around like headless flies. Especially those unlucky ones who were hit by incendiary bombs would not die immediately, but would be carried around with fire. Run around until you are burned alive or killed by friendly fire. The fire spread rapidly in the US military camp, and the shining fire was the best target. More gorgeous rockets dragged long trajectories and hit the enemy like meteors. Feeling unbearably hot, Stephen Carney suddenly opened his eyes and found that his tent was on fire. You must know that in the dream just now, the general had just received the presidential award in the White House and spoke in front of his competitors. Afterwards, the First Lady even invited him to the secret garden to chat about life. When people are in dire straits, Stephen Carney, who was awakened by the heat, immediately escaped from his tent and was stunned by the sight he saw. The military camp in front of them looked like the end of the world was coming. There were frightened and fleeing soldiers everywhere. The sounds of screams and explosions were endless, and the camp had been turned into a sea of fire. The wooden corpses crackled and exploded in the fire, and the surroundings were filled with choking smoke. The pungent smell spread into the mouth and made people nauseous. He fled this flaming hell as if he was dying, falling down several times along the way and bumping into several of his comrades, but Lieutenant General Stephen Carney miraculously survived. The gasping survivor saw meteors hitting his camp in famous parabolas from the nearby slopes. Others in the US First Army were not as lucky as him. The fires, explosions, smoke, and the resulting chaos and fear caused many soldiers to lose their way in the fire, and there were even unlucky reasons. I'm so stressed that I go crazy. I use my gun to kill the moving shadows. Chapter 516. A disaster. There was a purgatory-like scene inside the military camp. While outside the military camp, Stephen Carney was furious. He obviously didn't understand why his army was attacked by surprise. Major General Carter and his men were clearly in front of him, and he built the camp to be airtight. In addition, there was something scandalous that made the embarrassed general even more angry. What was the garrison under his command doing? Why haven't those damned attackers been eliminated yet? In fact, what Carney didn't know was that his patrol team responded very quickly, but the enemy's elite hunters had already laid an ambush on the road in advance, and it was really difficult to organize a counterattack and charge in the dark. Easy. The Austrian side did not have many people, but the victory was due to the sufficient amount of throwing weapons and rockets equipped. In addition, the well-prepared hunters had planted explosives on the opponent's possible attack route. Both sides suffered as soon as they came into contact with the US military. A very heavy loss. This made the officers of the patrol suddenly fall into the illusion that the main force of the Austrians has arrived. Naturally, they did not want to die by washing their necks stupidly, but hesitation would obviously amplify their fear. The American soldiers enjoyed the torment of the rain of fire, and their inner fears were infinitely amplified. Soon some people could not withstand the pressure and began to run away, and it was not easy to escape from the busy officers in the dark. When the officers discovered that their men were decreasing, it was too late to order the soldiers to charge. Only a few soldiers seemed to obey the orders of their superiors. Then as a burst of gunfire rang out, they ran back, and some even lay on the ground pretending to be dead. An officer still wanted to maintain military prestige, so he chose to shoot deserters as a warning to others. However, he forgot that many of these so-called soldiers were outlaws. Sure enough, after the officer shot a deserter, a bayonet stabbed him in the stomach. Hurry up, you country bumpkins. The officer's eyes widened with an expression of disbelief, and then several more bayonets were stabbed into his stomach. After the American soldiers stabbed their commander to death, they did not disperse in a hurry, but ran away while shouting, "Sir, the Austrian stabbed him to death. Run. The enemy is coming." This actually angered an Austrian Chasseur battalion commander who could understand English, and he cursed loudly, "Come back here. Who asked you to rush in? Keep it safe for me." The battalion commander checked for a long time, but found no shortage of soldiers under his banner. He thought to himself, could it be that the other side is charging with all their might? The cry of the American troops who were defeated had no other impact on the Austrian side, except that a few officers who knew English were still stunned and suspicious. But this news could not be worse for those unlucky people who had just escaped from the fire. A frustrated attack soon turned into a rout. Although Stephen Carney actually sent his surviving men to take over the troops as soon as he escaped from the fire, those officers who tried to prevent the rout were all shot dead without exception. A large number of defeated soldiers fled together with their comrades, who were still unaware of the situation. No one knew where they were fleeing to. Stephen Kearny finally had no choice but to personally lead the guards and his gathered troops to stop the rout. He thought that as the commander of the First Army of the United States, he was fully capable of turning the tide. After all, every soldier should know him as a general. But the reality was that Stephen Kearny and his troops were blocking the path of the rout, and someone fired before the two sides could talk to each other. Kearny's horse was frightened and raised its front hooves high to throw the guy away. His troops started to counterattack without receiving orders. The battle scene is very chaotic, and the reloading speed of muzzle-loading guns is slow, but as long as there are enough, it can also have the effect of one after another gunfire. It's just that under the darkness of night and the indistinguishability between friend and foe, these remaining American soldiers are unable to fill accurately. Although neither side wanted to come forward and fight to the death. With the help of the spreading fire, a bayonet battle began. The two parties launched a desperate fight for the same goal of survival. If you can stab it with a bayonet, stab it into the opponent's body. If it's stuck in the bone, use your fist or teeth. In short, use all your strength and do everything you can to survive. After a night of fighting, Stephen Kearny's troops achieved the final victory and survived to the end. However, when the sun rose again the next morning, they discovered that those who fought with them yesterday were actually their comrades, and the camp no longer existed, with stinking corpses scattered all over the ground. With a bandage on his head, Kearny stared blankly at the sad scene in front of him. He had suffered too much in this battle. More than 7,000 soldiers were killed or missing in action, and 80% of the supplies they carried were lost. Fortunately, he built the general arsenal outside the camp, and those precious artillery pieces are still alive. In fact, the main purpose of the Austrian attack was to destroy the opponent's arsenal, but due to insufficient effective intelligence, the target was not found. Otherwise, the effect of the firestorm would have been more severe, and there might have been more enemies who met God in advance. The number of people who died in the rocket attack and subsequent fires last night was about 1,000. In the melee caused by the rout, another about 1,500 people were killed, and the rest are missing. In fact, it is not surprising that there were so many deserters, because it was dark at the time, coupled with the chaos caused by the fireworks display and the fires they produced. It was easy for people to fall into fear and be unable to extricate themselves. What's more, the physical and mental exhaustion caused by trekking through mountains and rivers has stretched many soldiers' spirits to the limit, so it is only a matter of time before a big rout occurs. There were also some lucky people who were not killed, but their hearts were broken. These guys were the culprits of the melee last night. As for the number of Austrians who participated in the sneak attack, where they came from, and when the ambush was set up, the US military was at a loss. Many of Lieutenant General Stephen Kearny's officers were defeated in last night's attack. At this time, these survivors were staring at a relatively intact map in a daze. So far, the First Army of the Federal Army's knowledge of the Austrian army in California is limited to the information that the opponent has been here for many years and its approximate strength, and that it possesses artillery, rockets and a small number of light warships. The specific troop deployment, command style, tactical literacy, etc. were not known at all, which made some US military officers begin to doubt whether they could win this war. However, Lieutenant General Stephen Kearny did not fall into this kind of thinking at this time, and he had no doubt that the United States would be the ultimate victor. He knows the entire war plan of the United States clearly, and he also knows how terrifying the mobilization ability of the US military is. What's on Stephen Kearny's mind now is how this defeat could be covered up. Yes, this defeat is very likely to affect his career. Zachary Taylor in the Whig Party is his competitor, and the latter performed well in the battle to defend the Rio Grande. Not to mention that one of them was born in the sky and the other was born underground. Compared with the other, Kearny's resume is far inferior. If he hadn't been appreciated by Andrew Jackson for massacring several Indian villages, he would. It is impossible to sit in such a high position at this time. Write to President John Tyler and tell him that there are at least 100,000 Austrian troops in California. We have been deceived. Please send troops to support the country immediately. We will hold our ground here. Long live America. The Star-Spangled Banner will never fall. Chapter 517 Fire in the Backyard. Pacific, West Coast intensified by the sudden war. The actual number of Austrian troops stationed in California has exceeded 30,000. Coupled with John Cinna's mobilization during this period, more than half of its 200,000 immigrants have expressed their willingness to join the army. Point as an emerging immigrant land, California's population is mainly young adults, and there is almost no aging problem. Point it's just that when the sea routes are blocked, weapons transportation has become a thorny problem. And sending so many untrained young people to the battlefield will only waste precious human resources. Therefore, in the end, the authorities only temporarily recruited about 7,000 veterans and 20,000 laborers. Their main duties were to build fortifications and transport supplies. In addition, local Hispanics, Mexicans, Indians and Central American refugees are also very enthusiastic about joining the army. But Archduke Karl Ferdinand chose to ignore these requests and even felt that they were not even qualified to work as laborers. The reason for this is simple: the risks outweigh the benefits. Please note, this is his personal opinion, and does not represent the author's opinion. This man is always overly vigilant, and firmly believes that allies who are unreliable, and may stab him in the back at any time, are more dangerous than his enemies. Of course, in essence, it was still the so-called Greater German thought that was at work. After all, the entire high-level government, including John Cinna, was more or less influenced by this trend of thought. Archduke Karl Ferdinand did not choose to fight in the agricultural area of San Paciol like the Mexican army in history, but chose to retreat to the fortress in the San Gabriel Mountains. These are place names from the Mexican period. Fort San Gabriel is an outpost near Los Angeles. However, this suggestion was actually made by Franz several years ago, and was then conveyed by a representative who rushed across the ocean to California. If you choose to defend San Paciol, if the opponent has no plan to attack by force and plans to take a detour to attack, then this fortress in the center of the valley will obviously lose its role. Moreover, the Americans in history have adopted a two-sided attack method. If it is just a land war, they may not be able to lose an inch of territory. But if they choose to engage in harassment or assault warfare from the sea, it will be impossible for California's coastal defense forces to keep the enemy out. There is no need to repeat the power of naval guns. It is not difficult to rely on them to defeat the coastal defense forts of this era. With just 2 salvos, it is possible to paralyze a heavily financed coastal fortress. This is still taking into account the accuracy of the artillery at that time. If a salvo can hit all the targets, it will not be surprising if it collapses. Therefore, the only way to deal with the American maritime offensive is to shrink the defense and lure the enemy deeper. If the other party doesn't fall for the trick, it will turn into a long war of attrition. This combat mode is obviously extremely disadvantageous to the Austrian side. After all, the entire coastline of Nikko Prefecture reaches more than 5,000 kilometers, and it is extremely difficult to conduct a comprehensive defense. Because the opponent doesn't need to take the initiative at all. Just strolling along the coastal area twice a day can tire Austria to death. Just like the 800,000 King troops back then were just a number to the British. In local wars, the latter often had more numbers, not to mention the advantage in firepower. If they wanted to win, they had to take the initiative or actively defend, or consume the other party to death. At that time, the Qing dynasty had about 200,000 eight-banner soldiers, and about 600,000 green camp soldiers, with a total force of 800,000. For Austria at this time, it would be better to commit suicide if it wanted to use those 100, 200-ton boats to fight a naval battle with the Americans. Even if it could use a 1-for-1 tactic such as a kamikaze attack, the Americans would still be exhausted. Franz still doesn't know how much of a negative impact the US blockade of the coastline will have on the morale and mentality of California's defenders. So in the worst case scenario, John Cinna has the power to contact the British directly. After all, it is essential for senior officials in overseas colonies to have flexible decision-making power. Although this move will be extremely costly to implement, it will prevent the United States from forming a dominant position on the North American continent, and Britain will definitely do its best to defend this sacred land. Of course, that was just the worst plan. In fact, the land of sunlight was rich in products, and could be completely self-sufficient. Even if the enemy implemented a comprehensive blockade policy, the stored supplies would be enough to last for several years. John Tyler was indeed a very remarkable politician. Even though the Austrian authorities continued to suppress the American immigrants who fomented rebellion in California, he still pulled out a rebel team there, attacking from both sides and blooming in the center. Similar tactics can kill most people today, but fortunately, Franz does not belong to this era. The experience of later generations made him extremely concerned about every move of Americans at this time in San Diego. A middle-aged man wearing a windbreaker and a cowboy hat was announcing to the residents of the city, "From now on, California is the territory of the United States of America, and you are all citizens of the United States. Rejoice, brothers. Together we will bask in the sunshine of democracy and freedom. There is no form of oppression or exploitation, and everyone can freely express their opinions and views and enjoy equal rights and opportunities there. Legal fairness and transparency are the cornerstones of protecting people's rights, and the government's duty is to serve the people and protect their interests there. People can freely choose their own way of life and beliefs without suffering any form of discrimination or persecution. Long live America. Long live America." It has to be said that during the period of westward expansion, there were many heroic figures in the United States who had the spirit of adventure and pioneering. His inflammatory rhetoric successfully aroused the emotions of the people around him. Of course, there are a lot of trusts in it, but no matter what, it is indeed a very successful speech. But democracy and freedom are not achieved overnight. We must continue to overcome difficulties and defeat our enemies. Now in the Austrian Empire, they are still on our land. We must use the guns and bayonets in our hands to let them know who is the master here. Now take your guns and follow me to destroy those Austrians. Don't be afraid of sacrifice. God is with us. God is with us." The enthusiasm of the crowd was aroused. The man in the hat and trench coat kicked open the box at his feet, which was full of weapons and bullets. While several of his men began to distribute weapons to people, suddenly there was a trace of disharmony next to them. Dissent. "The speech you just made was indeed deceptive, sir. I almost believed it. But I'm sorry, we are Californians and Mexicans, and have nothing to do with the United States of America. Are you here to invade us? How come I've lived here for more than 10 years and never seen you?" The local aborigines asked questions, which made the man in the windbreaker feel embarrassed and had to shoot directly and explained, "He is the lackey of the tyrant Tazanana. He is the enemy of democracy and freedom. Let us go together now to fight away the Mexican tyrant and his accomplices, the Austrians." After witnessing this apostle with a mission of justice transformed into a perpetrator, some local residents began to hesitate. After all, the trenchcoat man's cruel behavior made him look more like a tyrant. The man in the trench coat had no choice but to shoot at the sky and roar, "Whoever is not with us is our enemy, the enemy of the United States of America." Spurred by the sound of gunfire, the crowd finally took action. This instigator was the famous John Charles Fremont, one of the greatest explorers in American history and a pioneer in the invasion of Mexico. Chapter 518 Target San Diego. In fact, after Franz's repeated warnings before, John Cena can be said to be cautious. The latter adopts an attitude of preferring to kill by mistake, rather than let go of possible rebels, but it was this man who put John Charles Fremont in. Before a large number of American immigrants and adventurers tried to enter California, they were either expelled or attacked by bounty hunters and natives. No one can drive into it and become a wedge point as an explorer who explored the Rocky Mountains. John Charles Fremont earned John Tyler's trust, so the latter gave the former an almost impossible task. That was to start a major rebellion while the Union Army was attacking California, helping the Union gain a foothold there. This uninhabited area aroused the adventurers' blood in the former. Fremont thought hard about several ways to enter California but failed. He even witnessed a Mexican regiment being massacred by the Austrian frontiers. Later, he came up with a clever idea, which was to enter from the sea, especially in an inaccessible no man's land like Baja California, which is very easy to penetrate. But it was impossible to organize a rebellion in such a deserted place, so he came up with a way to get the identity of an expedition captain from a senior Mexican official. John Cena has long been accustomed to this kind of Mexican expedition team. They are nothing more than a bunch of losers. They can usually be sent away with some benefits. As long as they don't touch the gold mines, he doesn't bother to care. As a result, Fremont led his team to brazenly start exploration and established a camp. After a long period of operation, the explorer finally bribed the Austrian local official in San Diego. News of the San Diego rebellion soon reached San Francisco, now Los Angeles, and John Cena couldn't help but choke with a lump in his throat. Does anyone else know the news? Colonel Mithras. No, sir, replied Mithras, the adjutant. Order to block the news. The news of the fall of San Diego must not be allowed to spread. Any lawless element who dare to spread rumors and discuss this matter will be arrested by me. If necessary, I authorize you to directly use lethal force to suppress it. Yes, sir. Colonel Mithras saluted with a military salute and walked out of the office with a solemn expression. At this time, San Francisco was the center of rule established by the Austrian Empire in California, and San Diego was only 190 kilometers away. It would only take 5 days for the rebels to march quickly to reach here. Maybe the enemy is already on their way to San Francisco. What's even more frightening is that San Diego is also an excellent port and can be used as a landing place for Americans. If the enemy and the rebels join forces, it will be a huge threat to San Francisco. At the same time, they can also choose to join with the US Army in the east to attack the San Gabriel fortress. Once it falls, the Austrian army will have to huddle in a few cities and wait for the fate of being divided and surrounded. John Cena picked up a cigar and put it in his mouth to calm down. He tried to light the fire several times, but couldn't make it. He even broke the match because his hands kept shaking. Crack. The flame finally lit up. John Cena took a deep breath, and Archduke Karl Ferdinand withdrew the lighter in his hand. Calm down. Things are not as bad as you think. The latter consoled him. How can I calm down? I'm a Jew. I sold candy when I was a kid. I shined shoes. I picked up cinder blocks everywhere. Unlike a nobleman like you, who is born with everything, even if you lose the battle, you will still be a royal prince when you go back. Still a general. If I lose, I will be no different from a piece of shit. I will still be a piece of shit that others step on and still find it dirty. You don't understand anything. You can lose countless times, but I can't afford to lose once. I'm our family's only hope. John Cena roared hysterically. Over the years, he has been cautious and conscientious in order to one day trample the Rothschild family under his feet and restore the Cena family's former glory. Watch your words and smoke less. It's not good for your health or career. Stop looking so grim and have a drink. Archduke Karl Ferdinand reminded that as the son of Archduke Karl, he perfectly inherited his father's reason and indifference. When he heard the word official career, John Cena remembered that Austrian officials were not allowed to smoke at will, such as in the royal palace in Vienna and in front of members of the royal family. He had indeed lost his mind just now. John Cena immediately put out the cigarette in his hand, but he did not touch the glass of wine because he knew that wine can cause sexual incest. Now it was indeed a critical moment of crisis, but he would not take the initiative to go to the British. Either you win completely or you lose completely. This is the truest thought in John Cena's heart, but of course he will not say it out loud. Archduke Karl Ferdinand continued to advise, don't worry, this rebellion is not a bad thing for us. John Cena's eyes immediately lit up. He didn't understand military matters, but he knew that the young Archduke in front of him was definitely a leader in the army. Your Highness, are you saying this is good news for us? I don't understand. What you were most worried about before was being attacked from both sides. Indeed. Karl Ferdinand replied sincerely, isn't this the most unfavorable situation you described, and we have no sea power to stop the Yankee Navy. If we scuttle the cargo ship, we might be able to blockade the port of San Diego. As John Cena spoke, a crazy idea suddenly occurred to him. Of course, such a professional idea could not have been thought up by a layman like him, and the person who came up with such a crazy and reasonable military strategy was naturally Archduke Friedrich. This method is indeed reasonable and feasible, but there is a problem. That is, it may be too late. After all, the Austrian side does not know the movements of the US fleet. If you rush to San Diego and meet the opponent rashly, it will be like a sheep entering a tiger's mouth. Another problem is that sinking yourself requires great courage or complete escape conditions. Apparently the California Coast Patrol didn't have it at this time. Archduke Karl Ferdinand shook his head and continued, "That was my brother's crazy strategy, and he was the only one who could actually execute it, and we couldn't do it. But the two-sided attack that I fear means that without my knowledge, since we already know the other parties' course of action, we might as well be bolder." "You mean take the initiative?" John Cena was a little incredulous, because the intelligence said that the US military had at least 100,000 people and hundreds of ships. "Yes, but the intelligence says." John Cena was interrupted by Archduke Ferdinand before he could finish speaking. "Read less American newspapers and read ours." The former took the newspaper and was shocked when he saw it. 5,000 people and 10 ships. This is impossible. What can this small force do? It's not important. Propaganda is always true and false. What's important is that I still have 20,000 troops on hand, and I was planning to launch an offensive to eliminate the outposts of the US First Army. Now I can change my plans to go to San Diego and fight the Americans. But isn't this too risky, Mr. Cena? The most difficult thing on the battlefield is not fighting, but judging the enemy's movements. Now there is a rebellion in San Diego that has determined the landing site of the US military, and what we have to do is to go there and defeat them. Chapter 519 Burn. Vice Admiral Robert Stockton is standing on the bow deck of the ship with great ambition. Although this expedition encountered some twists and turns, it was generally smooth, especially since he had just received great news that adventurous fellow John Charlie Fremont had prepared everything in San Diego. The letter was sent in advance. In order not to lose its direction on the vast sea, Fremont's men chose to send the letter to a port on the path that their fleet must pass through. The actual situation was that, because there was no telegraph system at the time, the fleet basically relied on receiving information at the port for communication. What a good guy. He has completed a task that others cannot complete. All we have to do now is to send the Marines ashore and wait for the fruits of victory. Robert Stockton expressed sincere admiration, and the adjutant Monty Akabaki on the side also echoed, "Yes, Captain Fremont's courage is admirable. He is a hero of the United States. Those gentlemen in Congress should give him a Purple Heart medal. He truly deserves the highest honor of the Purple Heart. Fremont has done his job, and now it's up to us. Go tell the Marine Corps boys that we are the most elite force in the United States of America, and we can only succeed but not fail." Lieutenant General Robert Stockton was actually not worried at all, because he was telling the truth and all of his men were real regular troops, rather than the kind of militia that was temporarily recruited or lacked training. There were many mercenaries who had participated in battles in South America and top students from West Point Military Academy. Thanks to the current propaganda in the United States, both high-level officials and the public are very optimistic about the US-Mexico War. Therefore, some well-connected wealthy people and politicians began to arrange their family members to join the army to gain gold. After all, the names of war heroes sounded particularly loud, and at the same time they were so close to the people. At that time, many politicians portrayed themselves as tough guys, and political parties also liked to support politicians with military backgrounds to come to power. After all, these guys were relatively simple-minded and easy to control. With the support of these wealthy people and politicians, the Marine Corps will naturally receive more resources coupled with sophisticated equipment and nearly perfect tactics. And now with the cooperation of the locals, he really couldn't imagine the possibility of losing. In addition, according to Robert Stockton's estimation, the main force of the Austrians should be fighting Stephen Kearny of the 1st Army of the Federal Army. As long as he lands in San Diego and then advances steadily, he can sweep the rear of California and completely lose hope of resisting. At that time, the Lieutenant General's dream of going straight to the Yellow Dragon will be realized, and the Golden Mountain of San Francisco will be captured in one fell swoop. However, according to the intelligence sent by Fremont, the actual number of Austrian troops seemed to far exceed the White House's estimate. It should be around 30,000 to 40,000, and the other side was mobilizing local immigrants to form a militia point. According to the most pessimistic estimates, the opponent's military strength will expand to 60,000 to 70,000 within 3 months. Moreover, the Austrian side carried a large amount of black powder in some of their acquisition ships, and the purpose was most likely to use these civilian ships to destroy our warships. This news really shocked Lieutenant General Stockton. Although it was a bit unbelievable, he also gave up the idea of forcibly attacking the opponent's heavily defended city point. The Austrians have been operating in California for many years. If those forts are equipped with large caliber coastal defense guns, and those self-destructing ships launch sneak attacks in the bay, wouldn't their fleet fall into a trap? First land in San Diego to replenish supplies, and then join up with Fremont's troops. At that time, whether it is to advance by land and water to take San Francisco, or to attack the San Gabriel fortress with Stephen K and his first army, it will be a matter of course. So there is absolutely no need to take risks now. With this in mind, the fleet led by Vice Admiral Stockton accelerated towards San Diego. After completing its supplies on the other hand, under Fremont's own direction, his troops captured San Diego and the stars and stripes were raised at City Hall Point. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, but he had a bad feeling. However, in order to boost morale, Fremont fulfilled his promise and allowed members of the rebel army to loot Point. He has a more important thing to do than manage those scum, which is to organize defense. Point. Fremont knew that San Diego could not afford to lose, and the other party was also very aware of it, so he believed that there would be a fierce battle soon. Point. On the Eastern Front battlefield, at Camp Rio Grande, General Zachary Taylor, as the commander, had decided to move out because there were too many deaths from yellow fever. But the damn Mexicans are like flies. They send cavalry to harass the US supply lines every day, and he has to send people to drive them away. Fortunately, the other side never made any big moves, and President John Tyler promised to send another 80,000 new troops. By then, our own military camp in the Rio Grande would have gathered 160,000 people. But Zachary Taylor was worried that the disease would spread further among the military. He hired many doctors and used many kinds of drugs, but they had no effect. As a superbug second only to plague and smallpox in human history, yellow fever was almost untreatable until the advent of a vaccine. A lot of futility led people like Zachary Taylor to believe in the legend of the Indian curse. In the Albuquerque fortress, Digo, wearing a mask, herded all the sick and wounded soldiers into a room. There were constant moaning and wailing sounds coming from inside, and some people even sensed something was wrong and smashed the door desperately to escape. But the first black general in Mexican history had no mercy in his eyes, not even his own brother, Bern. Several black soldiers looked at each other, as if they wanted the general to reconsider. Digo stepped forward, grabbed the torch, and personally lit the straw piled outside the house. The fire broke out immediately, and screams, wailing, and curses kept coming from inside. Then the black general kicked his guard captain to the ground hard, and when the latter was about to get up, he was stepped on the neck again. "Didn't you hear the president's order?" Digo roared, and the force on his feet became a little heavier. Guard Captain Digo shouted hoarsely, breathing hard, "Bonabrica, the president is gone." Bonabrica was Digo's name when he was a slave in the manor. With the president gone, don't we need to obey the orders? Digo, are you afraid of death? Digo roared with bloodshot eyes. I'm not afraid of death. Our brothers are not afraid of death either. Why don't you let them pick up their guns and fight the enemy? Don't you even give them the last dignity? Digo shouted with the same red eyes. The surrounding soldiers also lowered their heads and clenched their fists. Yes, they are not afraid of death, but they don't want to be burned to death by their own people like this. We must defend here, and your foolish actions will only expose the fact that we are weak. Mr. President said that anyone infected must be purified by flames, otherwise more people will be infected. Maka, Baker is also in it. They are my brothers and sisters. At this point, the sinister looking black man squatted on the ground, covering his face and crying bitterly. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 520 Outing. Gulf of Mexico. In an estate outside Veracruz, Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, commander of the US 2nd Expeditionary Force, was enjoying his dinner. There were the best cooks in Mexico and countless young and beautiful maids in the manor. The decoration was unparalleledly luxurious. Even the stairs, the armrests are all plated with gold point. This made him sigh with emotion. If the former owner of this manor could use the money for the navy, then the United States would probably be able to capture a fleet of battleships now. To be honest, although Winfield Scott was leading troops to fight on the enemy's land in Mexico, he was neither panicked nor anxious, because its Vice President Joaquin de Herrera had declared Tazanana treason, and had already announced the inauguration of Mexico's new president in St. Louis City. Joaquin de Herrera won over General José Abdelca of the Mexican army, and now they have nearly 80,000 troops, accounting for 80% of the army left by Tazanana Point. But siege warfare was a chore, and Winfield Scott had no intention of doing it himself. So the Talacas, who decided to be loyal to the United States, naturally took the initiative to eliminate the rebels. Winfield Scott's approach had three purposes. First, he was really too lazy to send troops and hope that someone would do it for him. Second, it was for President John Tyler to test the dog's loyalty. Third, as a puppet of the United States, it should not be too strong. Wonderful. The frustration of Joseph's army attack was something Winfield Scott had expected, but the latter would not act immediately upon receiving the former's request. He had to ensure that the enemy was in the weakest state before allowing the enemy to attack. My own officers waiting to be gilded went to pick peaches. This includes Grant, who will become famous in the future. This is all thanks to his father, who is a mayor. This war was like an outing for Grant. He flew in a luxurious first-class cabin, and after landing, he stayed directly in the home of a wealthy local in Veracruz. At this time, the future famous general was not very interested in fighting. He was still in love. Even the sea could not stop this fiery love. One after another, his love letters were sent across the sea to his lover Julia. Grant's boss, Colonel Dent, didn't like this top student from West Point Military Academy. If he knew that the former's lover was his daughter, his expression would be even more exciting. Because of Commander Winfield's approach, the soldiers and officers of the 2nd Expeditionary Force became extremely lazy and began to work hard. Soldiers at the bottom are not treated well, but this does not prevent them from being lazy. But what they didn't know was that the direction of the war was about to change dramatically. Joseph's army was overwhelming at first, burning, killing, and looting everywhere, but when they arrived at Mexico City, they seemed to have hit an iron plate. No matter what reasons his soldiers and officers used, the other party refused to let them into the city and shot at them. Abt was so angry that he ordered a storm. However, after so many years of management by Tazanana, Mexico City has long been like an iron wall. More than half of the artillery in Mexico is on the city wall of the capital. Joseph's army consists of nothing more than military police and security forces from various places, or strong men captured temporarily. It is the first time for them to go to the battlefield, let alone siege the city. As soon as the cannon fired, some people turned around and ran away. Seeing someone running away, others followed suit. As a result, 3 attacks were launched in a row, but none of these people rushed within 300 meters of the wall of Mexico. José Apter was so angry that his whip broke. He drew his pistol and ordered, "Whoever dares to take a step back, I will kill him now." Several New Mexico soldiers dressed as farmers looked back at the speaking commander and smiled reassuringly when they saw that he only had a small gun in his hand. Joseph snorted 2 puffs of white air from his nose. "Where is the supervising team?" Immediately, a group of well-dressed New Mexico Army soldiers ran over. These people were his direct descendants and his trump card. It's just that Joseph didn't expect that he, a civilized man, would have to resort to such barbaric methods in the end. Under the urging of the supervising team, the queue finally started to march. At the same time, the sound of artillery fire on the city wall gradually became smaller as the distance between the queue and the city wall continued to shrink. This gave Joseph great confidence and immediately shouted, "Fight for freedom! Down with the tyrant Tazanana." Then Coincidentally, not knowing whether the other side was responding to him, the cannons on the city wall rang out again. But this time the bullets fired were not solid bullets, but shotgun shells and high explosive bullets. The shell exploded in the air and splashed a cloud of blood on the ground. At the same time, the gates of Mexico City also opened. But what came out was not the local magistrate who came to surrender, but a group of howling Indian cavalry. Whoa, 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 whoa. The line infantrymen who were originally stunned by the shells were still in a daze, looking at the scene of their comrades lying in a pool of blood. But as the familiar voice reached their ears, these farmers with guns immediately chose to turn around and run away, facing the tide of defeated troops. The supervising team of several hundred people really had no choice at all. Soon they were also dragged into the rout, and the more unlucky ones were knocked down and trampled to death alive. The lucky guys will be chased around by the Indian cavalry like ducks. Of course, these riders do not dare to pursue too far. After all, the enemy is outnumbered. This is mainly because the Indians' military discipline is also very bad. The white officer in charge of commanding them took a lot of effort to call back these hot-blooded guys in the first contact between the two sides. Joseph suffered an unprecedented rout. However, although the scene was terrible, the statistical losses afterwards were not huge. The next day, Joseph chose to engage in an artillery battle with the Mexico City defenders. The result was predictably 200 versus 30, high versus low, not to mention that the defenders still had bunkers. Joseph was defeated again. After that, the New Mexico Marshal tried various ways to attack the city every day. Anyway, the losses were not big. He felt that he was getting better and better, but what he didn't understand was the loss of morale that was more terrible than the loss of troops. Joseph's salary arrears are serious in the army, and the so-called pensions are even more illusory. Several days of strong attacks caused a large number of wounded, and the military camp was in urgent need of medicine. What was worse than this was that the military rations were also running out. The supplies promised by Joaquin de Herrera did not arrive as expected because the new president did not take them to heart. Instead, he focused all his attention on searching for the treasure and tried every means to transport it out of the country. Joaquin de Herrera promised to be a pragmatist. He chose to surrender to the Americans because the latter promised to make him president of Mexico, support his dictatorship, and make him prosperous and wealthy in the future. But now the Americans are completely acting like emperors. Joaquin de Herrera appeared to be respectful, but when he returned home, he threw the medal issued by the Americans to the ground. How can a man who lives between heaven and earth live in depression for a long time under human beings? Chapter 521. A small goal. In Mexico City, Vice President Ruvel, who is sitting in the capital, cannot be said to be a military strategist or a politician, but a messenger under Tazanana. Although he has a high and powerful position, he has neither political vision nor military literacy. His only advantage is that he has great personal admiration and loyalty to his boss. Therefore, Joseph, who had experienced hundreds of battles, did not take this corporal seriously. However, he paid a heavy price for his pride and underestimation of the enemy. He attacked the city for several weeks and suffered more than 10,000 casualties. However, didn't even touch the city wall. This is naturally due to the city defense system that Tazanana spent a lot of money to build, or 3-layer city wall plus an artificial slope made of sand and gravel. Moreover, Austria was responsible for building the city walls of Mexico City, and no corners were cut on the materials used. In particular, several turrets used reinforced concrete structures for the first time. This gave the Mexican government forces an advantage in the confrontation with the rebels, whose light artillery was completely unable to shake this new type of fortress. Not to mention that the rebels were using old antiques, 3-pound and 4-pound guns, left over from the Spanish during the Napoleonic period. Even the largest caliber field gun in the European war at this time, 12 pounds, about 76 millimeters, could not cause effective damage. In fact, even the 75mm cannon from World War II cannot effectively damage reinforced concrete structures. Of course, if you try to bring in a siege gun of more than 24 pounds or the British 68-pound battleship main gun, no matter how strong the reinforced concrete is, it will be no different from an ordinary masonry structure. Once it is hit, it will immediately break like a wooden board. Joseph actually tried using congreve rockets But these large fireworks were only particularly effective against wooden buildings. They were fine for burning cities, but not for destroying them. Point back to the main story. In fact, it was not Rouvel who was in charge of commanding the city defense at this time, but the employees of the Oma United Development Company. Many of them are retired officers and are very familiar with the battlefield. Moreover, the intensity of the US-Mexico War is not worth mentioning compared with the life and death European battlefields. These former soldiers actually have different views on this war. Some people think that, as long as they stick to it, Tazanana will return to help sooner or later, because this is his hometown and he cannot give up. This view is shared by most people, and they also feel that their country will not sit idly by and ignore what is happening in the Americas. You must know that Austria has an army of 3,000 people in Central America. Of course, some people have raised objections, because intelligence coming from all directions shows that Mexico has fallen into full-scale civil strife, and civil wars are fighting everywhere in the country. And from the size of the rebels outside the city, it can be concluded that Joseph has gambled all his wealth this time, and will never give up until he takes Mexico City. Therefore, some people propose to break out. After all, the rebels had not yet carried out a real siege. At least the west and north directions were empty. However, this proposal met with strong opposition, not to mention that Mexico City is a high city, a deep pool, and has sufficient ammunition supplies. Even without these favorable conditions, it is better to stand firm than to run around like a headless fly. After all, news between the capital and the outside world is now transmitted through carrier pigeons. No one knows what is going on outside, and there is nowhere they can go once they leave here. Instead of running around like headless flies, it is better to wait for help. After all, they pay huge profits to Vienna and the Mexican government every year. Moreover, the first batch of aid from Austria to Mexico included a large number of weapons and medical personnel, which showed that the empire did not intend to give up here. The Oma United Development Company has a very good reputation in Mexico, and is also backed by the government of Tazanana. In many cases, its credibility is even stronger than that of the Mexican government. Therefore, taking over the city defense did not arouse the resentment of the locals. On the contrary, it made them feel at ease. After all, those soldiers and civilians know better than anyone what kind of virtues the Mexican army and officials have. After being besieged for a month, there was no chaos in the city. On the contrary, due to military control, the gangsters and nobles had to restrain themselves, and it seemed orderly. Outside the city, the rebel camp, the ground was full of garbage and filth, and the stench permeated the entire military camp, just like a camping site that had not been cleaned before. It was obviously known, but there were still many soldiers sleeping on the ground. These people didn't even have a quilt. The tragic casualties and low morale caused by multiple failed sieges filled the soldiers' faces with frustration and exhaustion. Sighs and groans arose one after another, and on the other side it was a noisy scene. Due to the lack of food and medicine, many soldiers fought for the limited supplies, insulted each other, and even fought. At the same time, weapons, flags, and siege engines were thrown aside without any order. Discipline in the military camp could not be maintained, and idle soldiers gathered together to play cards or act without authorization. And the officers didn't bother to care. As long as those guys didn't leave the military camp and become deserters, they would turn a blind eye. Joseph was so drunk in the headquarters that he tore the map hanging on the wall to pieces, and other officers were also thinking about their future. Joaquin de Herrera promised a lot to his supporters, but now not only the previous promises cannot be fulfilled, but even food and medicine are not enough. If no more supplies arrive, their strong men will be able to tear them to pieces without Rouvel fighting out of the city. After a while, the helpless Joseph was even more depressed. He originally thought that he would be very impressive after being promoted from general to marshal, but he was sent by Joaquin de Herrera to recover the lost ground. Now that he was bruised and bloody, the president and the Americans were watching the show and ignoring him. He was getting more and more angry as he thought about it. Budima, the Mexican version of the mother-in-law. These damn cursed maggots. If you don't send me supplies, I will take you to wash away their hometown. The officers at the command center immediately became energetic, knowing that the city of San Luis was Joaquin de Herrera's hometown. This city was founded on silver mines, and there were many wealthy businessmen in it. But there was no decent city defense, only an inspection team supported by Joaquin de Herrera Point. Unlike Mexico City, where the city is high and the water is deep, human lives are needed to fill it. Point as a result, the officers came up with suggestions one after another, and all of them were so full of ideas that they couldn't stop. After all, everyone wanted to make a fortune. When they became rebels, Joseph's tricks eyes immediately brightened up. He felt that he could do what Tasangana could do, and Joaquin de Herrera ready for the position of president. What's more, at this time, the subordinates were united, and taking St. Louis was like picking something out of a bag. By then all the gold and silver in the city will be his, as well as the beautiful Miss Fantasia Rima, Joaquin de Herrera's lover, and it can be seen from the attitude of the Americans that they will never stand up for Joaquin de Herrera. As long as he can win the city of St. Louis, then he will be the new president of Mexico, and can also get the support of the United States. Why not? Without any hesitation, Joseph ordered the army to prepare to set off, targeting St. Louis. Chapter 522 Prelude to the Storm. On the outskirts of Veracruz, Tasmania's private estate. Lieutenant General Winfield Scott was very satisfied with this temporary headquarters, and the news that had just been received, that Joseph had rebelled and was preparing to slaughter St. Louis, did not surprise the general. He just asked his adjutant to be prepared to deal with the new ruler Joseph, and then continued to have dinner with the young heroes he invited, to America. The young officers did not panic when they saw the commander, so they naturally felt that they had nothing to fear, and continued to drink and have fun. At this time, the clever young man began to boast about the god of war who had outsmarted the port of Veracruz. General Winfield is really a calm person. He can handle such a difficult emergency while having dinner with me. This requires absolute calmness and judgment to find the best solution to the problem. Yes, this calmness is really worth learning from. You are my life mentor, some even said with tears in their eyes. It is a great honor to have dinner with you. Your words are the most precious treasure. At this time, there was a discordant voice. Grant said casually with his mouth full, but Mexico City hasn't been captured yet, and who will believe our promise after doing so? Shouldn't our purpose here be to open up territory for the great United States? Now that I'm drunk and dreaming all day long in this manner, my body is getting rusty. His ridicule was immediately besieged by everyone's words. General Winfield did not express dissatisfaction with this, but instead advised everyone to listen to different voices immediately. Everyone burst into applause, praising the general's noble character. Grant said something disdainfully again. Can a war be won with good character? Then, the next day Grant and his infantry company were assigned the most difficult job. However, as the eldest son of the mayor of Georgetown, the future Northern Star still received special care. He got a horse as a means of transportation at the cost of taking his people to patrol the border every day, which was a bit overwhelming for an infantry company. But instead of riding a horse, Grant bought a carriage and took turns resting with the soldiers. Washington White House. John Taylor tore the report in front of him into pieces and cursed. There are 100,000 Austrian troops in California. Then they will still be hiding in the ravines? I'm afraid they have already marched along the Mississippi River to Washington. The senior staff in the president's office were all frightened by this scene, because their boss was a decent person and rarely used uncivilized words. But today was really unusual. The United States has mobilized 280,000 people so far in the war, but the cost of war mobilization is much more than he expected. I don't know why, but suddenly all the suppliers of the US military started to increase their prices. Moreover, as soon as the war started, personnel, weapons, ammunition, medicines, and logistics supplies were consumed rapidly. Fortunately, Soros's bank took action in time, so that he could ensure the smooth operation of the economy. The British and Austrians, as well as, out of nowhere, the Russians, were protesting the war and denouncing Washington's aggression. John Taylor himself, even if he was eloquent, could not have said so. Many battle-experienced diplomats. What is even more terrible is that Britain and Austria have proposed the possibility of sanctioning the United States through a trade embargo. Although the Austrian navy is not powerful, it is the second largest buyer after Britain. Without Britain and Austria, America's cotton would have rotted in the ground. In addition, Zachary Taylor led hundreds of thousands of troops to confront the Mexicans across the river, which also made John Taylor angry to death. Yellow fever was actually endemic in the Rio Grande. What made him even more angry was that Winfield actually started vacationing in Mexico. His army set up camp in Veracruz and even built simple fortifications nearby. In fact, General Winfield wanted to occupy Veracruz permanently, but this did not fit with the strategy of John Taylor, who believed that Mexico was too big for the United States to swallow all at once. And the main target of this war was California gold. Only by obtaining the gold there and opening up the road to the Pacific Ocean can the United States truly spread its wings and take off, thereby realizing its manifest destiny of unifying North America. Robert Stockton, who was responsible for attacking California from the sea, lost contact. In fact, this was not his fault. Because the current maritime communication methods are indeed relatively primitive, not to mention that the Panama Canal has not yet been opened at this time. The personnel delivering the message have to go around South America to report the situation to Washington. Punta Arenas was the southernmost port of the South American continent at this time, and was the only place to pass between the east and west sides of South America. A shooting incident occurred in the only local tavern. The deceased was an American businessman. The cause is said to be that he provoked a sexy waitress in the pub and then got into an argument with others and was shot dead. This was originally a very ordinary little thing, but it was just an appearance. The businessman actually worked for the US government, and his mission was to send back the latest intelligence on the expedition fleet. The person who killed him was a sleeper team specially arranged by Franz, including the waitress, who was also a specially trained agent. To defeat your enemies, it's best to turn them deaf and blind. Franz, who came from a later generation, knew the importance of information for war, and it was too easy to calculate with intention and without intention. Although John Taylor was very angry with his incompetent generals, he did not know how to fight and could only rely on this group of big soldiers, so the politician signed a new presidential decree announcing that an additional 50,000 people would be sent to support General Cunning, while continuing to recruit new troops and raise supplies. John Fremont spent several days guarding San Diego, but did not see even a trace of an Austrian. The reply given by the spies sent out was that the Austrians were collecting supplies everywhere and seemed to intend to defend San Francisco. This made the adventurer very depressed. He originally wanted to have a collision between men, but he didn't expect the other party to be so cowardly. However, this also confirmed that the United States' dominance of the North American continent was destined. What Fremont didn't know was that the main force of the Austrian army, about 10,000 men, led by Archduke Karl Ferdinand himself, had bypassed San Diego and was hidden in a valley not far away. This was originally one of the Austrian army's military camps, so it didn't alarm Fremont. The reason why the Austrians did not mobilize in full force was that they were not sure of the specific time when the US troops would land. If its intentions are known to the enemy in advance, the US fleet will most likely directly attack San Francisco. After all, Golden Mountain is the main target of the Americans. At that time, the US military with maritime fire support will be able to advance and attack and retreat and defend. The Austrian side wants to lure the enemy deep and then annihilate them in one fell swoop, which is like fishing for the moon from a haystack. Of course, the key point is to make the opponent paralyzed. After all, if one side acts too strongly, the US military, who is aware of it, may simply choose to defend in place. In the end, it will still be a tug-of-war, not what Archduke Ferdinand wanted. War of Annihilation. Chapter 523, Battle of Escondido Village. St. Louis City. In the Mexican Provisional Presidential Palace, Joaquin de Herrera was looking at the list of properties handed over by his men, and he couldn't help frowning. The amount of property seized was far less than he expected. Joaquin de Herrera thought he would become rich overnight and then flee to Europe to apply for political exile so that he could live a life of spending money like water for the rest of his life. In fact, it was not that he had misjudged the city's wealth, but that his subordinates were either related to the wealthy people in the city or were in cahoots with each other. Joaquin de Herrera's plan to make money was known to others early on. so he searched for it for several weeks without finding much money. On the contrary, he made himself very angry. In fact, Joaquin de Herrera gradually became aware of the problem, but there was not much time left for him. Josaphat is leading his tiger and wolf army on the way, and a bloody massacre seems inevitable. However, on the other side of the North American continent, the bloody feast has begun. Robert Stockton's fleet had just arrived in San Diego, and before John Fremont could even exchange a few words with his old friend, the latter's men sent word that an Austrian army of about 10,000 people was approaching San Diego. This is exciting news for the former. He is also worried that, if the Austrians huddle in the fortress, the war will last for a long time, which will make him lose face. But now the problem is solved. The Austrians chose to take the initiative. As long as this detachment could be wiped out, they would no longer be able to organize a counterattack. Robert Stockton's Marine Corps would be able to fully take the initiative, and the US military would be able to take California just around the corner, so Lieutenant General Robert Stockton made a bold decision. He decided to use the 25,000 Marines he brought to directly surround the advancing Austrian army. But what he didn't know was that the other party's commander also had an adventurous plan. Of course, Austria's behavior was not completely unintentional, but a rigorous judgment made by Archduke Karl Ferdinand, after receiving accurate intelligence from Washington. In the end, the most tragic encounter in the US-Mexican War officially started. The Austrian army coming from the direction of San Francisco suddenly stopped in the village of Escondido, northeast of San Diego, and began to build fortifications. This was exactly what Robert Stockton wanted. He was afraid that the other party would simply turn around and run away. As a result, the US Marines who had been drifting at sea for several months did not take much rest, but chose to attack directly. Although Escondido village has some buildings and simple walls, it cannot be called a defensive facility. Facing the larger number of American troops, the Austrian army did not choose to retreat. The two sides engaged in a fierce artillery battle. As soon as they came up, the latter's artillerymen were obviously of higher quality and more experienced, but the former's bronze cannons were indeed superior in terms of power and rate of fire. However, this tragic victory was obviously not what Robert Stockton wanted, and he ordered the entire army to begin an encirclement. The battle was extremely fierce. This unit was worthy of being the elite of the US military. With its superior firepower and 3 times the number of enemies, it suppressed the Austrian counterattack. Of course, the casualties were exaggerated, but they were still within the tolerance of Robert Stockton. Due to the complete suppression of firepower and troops, the Austrian army had to retreat to the village for defense, using ditches and houses as bunkers to continue to deal with the US military. In fact, the Austrian side did not expect that its own firepower would be suppressed, because Archduke Karl Ferdinand had prepared a large number of infantry, artillery and rockets for this decoy force in advance. As a result, the previously invincible rockets could not change the battlefield situation when the artillery was suppressed. Although they caused a lot of damage to the US military's line infantry, they could not stop the opponent's advancement. Although the Austrian army was small in number, it was far superior to the US military in terms of morale and technical and tactical qualities. However, even so, it still fell into an unimaginable passive situation, which highlighted the importance of artillery on the battlefield at this time. Fortunately, Archduke Karl Ferdinand's reinforcement came out from behind in time to prevent the morale of the Austrian troops in the village of Escondido from collapsing. Robert Stockton was originally supervising the battle on the front line. The situation on the battlefield was not optimistic. Although the US military was advancing steadily, he knew that this victory was achieved with human lives. Such a heavy loss was unexpected by Robert Stockton, but he cannot give up now, because giving up the offense now is equivalent to giving up his official career, so he must grit his teeth and persevere. Report. Your Excellency, Commander, a large number of Austrian troops have appeared behind our army. What? Robert Stockton's reaction was both shocked and angry, while his adjutant looked completely incredulous, because according to common sense, even if the Austrian army has reinforcement, they should come from the direction of San Francisco or the San Gabriel fortress. The enemy's vanguard is a large number of cavalry, followed by a large number of infantry. Brigadier General Kana is blocking the enemy, and we have suffered heavy casualties since the US military concentrated its artillery on the frontal battlefield to suppress the Austrian troops in the village of Escondido. There were no artillery at all in the rear. This was a characteristic of tactics at the time, concentrating artillery on one point to strike until the enemy's line collapsed. Point of course, the Austrian cavalry would not be so stupid and directly attack the opponent's infantry line. They brought a large number of cavalry, artillery and rockets, which was an area they were familiar with. Use absolutely superior firepower to deliver a brutal blow to the enemy, and then send cavalry to attack and follow up after the opponent's formation collapses. To expand the results, Brigadier General Kahne's brigade was the reserve force of the US Army. It was originally planned to enter the battlefield at the most critical time. However, due to the sudden appearance of the Austrian cavalry, he led his army to actively attack. After all, if you ignore these cavalry, it would be great fun if they rush to the rear of Robert Stockton and are decapitated by the Austrian army. Commodore Kahner of the US Navy is indeed worthy of being a top student who graduated from West Point Military Academy, and his soldiers are worthy of being elite. They quickly formed a classic infantry and cavalry confrontation formation, the hollow square formation. However, the Austrian cavalry did not plunge into an array of bayonets and muskets like the French underwear marshal did. Instead, they stopped about 500 meters away from the infantry square, and then began to unload the artillery and set up the rocket launcher, while Brigadier General Kahner was puzzled. The inhumane fire attack began. Although cavalry artillery is usually light artillery such as 3-pounders and 4-pounders, they are very lethal at a distance of about 500 meters. Solid artillery shells flew into the US military formation like bowling balls. For a while, broken limbs and broken arms were flying in the sky, and wailing sounds came one after another. Chapter 524, The Battle of Escondido Village. Compared with solid artillery shells, rocket shells are more lethal on planes. Rockets penetrated the densely populated array one after another, clearing out a large area of US troops every time. Although every time one person fell, another person would take over, but Brigadier General Kahner's heart was beating. You must know that these people are regular American troops, and each of them is a veteran who has served for more than 5 years. They have undergone a lot of military training to be able to stabilize their formation at this time. There are only 8,600 such good soldiers in the entire American Federation. But the morale of even such a unit was on the verge of collapse at this time. If it weren't for the swords of the supervising team behind them, they might have fled long ago. Brigadier General Kahner had no choice at this time, because it was impossible for his infantry to catch up with the cavalry, and it was only a matter of time before morale collapsed under such firepower. The most important thing was that there was no textbook to solve this situation. Method. Just as Brigadier General Kahner was hesitating, a cannonball landed on the ground in front of him, then bounced up and smashed the tool he used to think like a watermelon. The Brigadier is dead. Run. The elite US military, which had long been on the verge of collapse, finally burst out with its final strength, roaring and shouting as they fled towards Robert Stockton's army. However, if the infantry chooses to escape when facing the cavalry, it is tantamount to condemning themselves to death. The Austrian cavalry, which had been ambushed for a long time, rushed out from the flanks and attacked the panicked American troops indiscriminately. During this period, some brave American soldiers wanted to turn back and fight back, but the huge impact brought by people on horses was simply not something ordinary people could withstand, let alone the large number of lancers among the Austrian cavalry. Austria and Poland characteristics. In fact, the hussars are not without pistols, but they are usually not used during charges. These pistols are usually used when they are unfortunately killed or in melee. Even though France had already introduced revolvers into the Austrian army's equipment system at this time, these hussars were unwilling to use pistols in charges and surprise missions. This is not a matter of chivalry, but the pistols at that time were too uncontrollable. First of all, the hit rate was uncontrollable. Not everyone was proficient in mounted shooting, and the hit rate of the pistol itself was also very worrying at that time. At that time, the effective range of pistols was usually within 30 meters, and even the effective range of modern pistols was mostly within 50 meters. However, in fact, it is difficult to hit the target beyond 15 meters. In addition, while moving at high speed, it will also reduce the hit rate. Moreover, soldiers in this era seriously lack live fire shooting training. Unless they are a natural marksman, they can't really practice mounted shooting with 30 rounds of ammunition a year as for American cowboys who frequently hit the same coin with a pistol several hundred meters away, or when riding a horse and passing an oncoming train. They accurately penetrated the gap between two glass windows with pistol bullets, avoiding the conductors and the dense crowd of passengers. Hit the train robber on the other side. These can basically be understood as American martial arts novels. After all, it is not impossible for a Superman with 8 times the speed of light to seriously injure mortals with gunpowder propelled firearms. The second is the instability of firearms. Various malfunctions of firearms at that time emerged one after another, and jamming and misfiring were commonplace closer to home. In fact, cavalry wielding sabers in pursuit battles are much more frightening than pistol cavalry, and their killing efficiency is much higher. Brigadier General Carter's elite force was wiped out before Robert Stockton and his reinforcement could arrive. Robert Stockton did not have many cavalry, and it was very difficult to feed livestock on a long sea voyage. Historically, Robert Stockton's expeditionary force had less than 500 cavalry. At this time, Fremont's occupation of San Diego contributed a lot of horses and mules to the US military. Although there is no shortage of horses in North America, war horses are still hard to come by. So at this time Robert Stockton had less than 1,000 cavalry, and the quality of the horses was much lower than the Austrian war horses. The cavalry on both sides did not directly fight after discovering each other. The American pistol cavalry drew their pistols and waited for the Austrian cavalry to charge. At this time, Brigadier General Ernest of the US Cavalry Brigade ordered his cavalry to stand ready and prepare to let the barbarians of the Old World experience the tactics of the New World. Each US Army pistol cavalry is equipped with 2 revolvers. 1,000 people have 2,000 guns. Each gun can shoot 6 rounds of ammunition, for a total of 12,000 rounds of ammunition. According to Brigadier General Ernest's estimate, there were no more than 3,000 Austrian cavalrymen. That means every 4 bullets could hit 1 Austrian soldier, and he would be able to completely annihilate this cavalry force in the Old World. Just when Brigadier General Ernest was still imagining that he was about to receive the Purple Heart Medal from Congress at the White House, the Austrian cavalry pushed up cavalry cannons and rocket launchers. Brigadier General Ernest couldn't help shouting, "I'm a fool." A burst of artillery fire caused the US cavalry to fall off their horses. Especially many of the US war horses were not trained. When they heard the explosion, they would be frightened and raise their front hooves high to throw the US soldiers off their horses. Then the frightened horses fled in all directions, easily breaking up the cavalry line laid out by Brigadier General Ernest. Just as he reorganized his team, the second round of firepower began. These cavalry did not have the morale and discipline of the previous elite troops, and they soon collapsed. This group of collapsed cavalry became the vanguard for the Austrian army to break through the US defense line. The Austrian cavalry followed the US cavalry and rushed towards the command center, where Robert Stockton was located. Robert Stockton was not a mediocre man. He immediately ordered the shooting of the defeated American troops driven by the Austrian army, which prevented the war situation from deteriorating further. But the ensuing firepower attack completely subverted the famous general's outlook on life. How can the cavalry have such strong firepower? The tasks of the cavalry in this era were usually vigilance, reconnaissance, patrolling, outflanking and cutting leaks, harvesting the remaining enemies. It was mainly Franz's suggestion that the cavalry carry a large number of light equipment with powerful firepower at the same time. The continuous optimization of Congreve rockets has made this tactic possible, and the installation of rubber tires on the artillery has greatly enhanced its mobility. Franz put in a lot of effort to implement this tactic, and he also received rewards on the battlefield at this time. Under constant fire from cavalry, artillery and new anti-infantry rockets, Robert Stockton simply could not maintain the morale of his infantry. So he could only deploy the troops and artillery that besieged Escondido village to block the Austrian advance troops. But this was not a wise move. The cavalry has a huge advantage, that is, its high mobility. As soon as Robert Stockton mobilized the army, the Austrian cavalry changed positions to attack. Over time, these American troops collapsed due to exhaustion. At this time, San Diego was attacked by the main force of the Austrian army led by Archduke Karl Ferdinand. The Californians, Hispanics, under the bear banner, betrayed faster than the Indians. John Fremont had to escape aboard an American warship. In order to prevent the fleet from falling into the hands of the Austrians, he had no choice but to leave Port Point. So the question is, how does Robert Stockton leave? Let's finish writing this war first, and then write the story of Europe. Point by the way, does anyone want to read the story of Robert E. Lee? Chapter 525, Battle of Escondido Village. Outside the village of Escondido, the harassment of the Austrian cavalry greatly weakened the US military's firepower and troop superiority in the village. Point the billowing black smoke rising in the direction of San Diego has made the US military even more panicked. After all, no matter what era the army is, once it runs out of logistical supplies, it will become a chicken and a dog. This is an almost unchangeable law. Point as an excellent commander, Robert Stockton naturally knew what this meant, so he immediately ordered the storming of Escondido village. Only in this way could victory be achieved at the negotiation table. Point however, Robert Stockton still overestimated his troops. After the Austrian troops in the village of Escondido discovered that the American firepower had weakened, they immediately began to organize a counterattack. Point the elite troops of the Austrian army are concentrated on the east side where the US military's defense is relatively weak. Bullying the weak with the strong is not a clever method, it is just a conventional warfare idea. Point however, actual use on the battlefield requires strong discipline and execution, which is naturally inseparable from daily training, education, and the commander's personal ability. Point in fact, the ideological education of the army in this era was very backward. All the content was summed up in 2 words, obedience, and the methods adopted were sticks, whips, and torture. Point Ludwig von Benedek was the supreme commander of Escondido village at this time. He was not of noble origin. His father was a doctor and his mother was the daughter of a shoemaker. So, although Benedek graduated from the Maria the Sa Military Academy in 1822, historically he was only a colonel until 1848. During the Italian War, the Maria the Sa Military Academy was essentially the Austrian version of Wampoa Military Academy, providing the empire with a large number of senior officers. Although Ludwig von Benedek served as Moltke's background in the historical Austro-Prussian War, he even almost became the scapegoat after the defeat of the war. But I have to say that he was actually one of the more outstanding among the younger generation of generals in the Austrian Empire, and there were many reasons for his failure. Point for example, as the person in charge of the Italian side, he has limited understanding of the northern battlefield. His position is too low to command the arrogant and capable generals under his command. His concept of artillery and infantry is backward. His opponent is too outstanding and has strong military technology, etc. Just after the creation of the military district of California, Archduke Karl Ferdinand complained about the lack of good officers at his command, and Field Marshal Radetzky recommended Ludwig von Benedek to the War Ministry. Point however, Count Latter, the Minister of War at the time, attached great importance to family background. He believed that Benedek was neither a noble nor a Hungarian and his loyalty could not be guaranteed, so he refused to reward him for promotion. Point then Franz thought of a compromise and asked Ludwig von Benedek to go to California to become a colonel. Point Count Latter personally valued Archduke Franz's opinion very much. He was deeply influenced by Rorschach, the old magician, and he readily agreed without ever seeing Franz as an ordinary person. Point later, Archduke Karl Ferdinand felt that Benedek was indeed an excellent soldier. In fact, in a sense, the two had similar concepts and both were defensive generals. As a result, the former promoted the latter to his adjutant and part-time chief of staff, which greatly improved the latter's status and eventually became the commander of Escondido village at this time. Point as an outstanding general, he has keen insight and intuition, as well as excellent organizational skills. On the other hand, the command of the US military at this time was extremely chaotic, with as many as 16 brigadiers. Lieutenant General Robert Stockton naturally knew this weakness of his. As a result, each of them was responsible for their own area, which seemed to be in order, but in fact, after the war started, the arrangement was completely messed up. Point due to the huge gap in the quality of the soldiers on both sides, and the fact that the Austrian army occupied superior terrain, the US military suffered heavy casualties, but it could still rely on high morale. to maintain it at first point. However, as the attack failed to take place for a long time, and the reserve team was delayed in arriving, and some of the troops responsible for the siege were even transferred away, some keen officers already discovered that something was wrong. So they began to retreat. The officers' emotions were easily transmitted to the soldiers, coupled with the tenacity of the Austrian army. The US military units began to humility among themselves. The result of this humility was that the already loose siege network was full of loopholes, and it also strengthened Benedek's determination. The US army, which was slowly advancing on the east side, suddenly found that the Austrian army's gunfire had stopped. Just when everyone was confused, a US Army brigadier general suddenly laughed. Haha. The Austrians are out of bullets. Capture that royal prince. That's such a huge fortune. American soldiers, here's your chance to realize the American dream. Get rich today. As soon as the American soldiers heard this, they immediately rushed forward like chicken blood. But what greeted them was not gold or banknotes, but bright fireworks. Suddenly a large number of rockets were fired from the ruins of the village, and dense explosions continued to sound. The US military, which had been full of momentum just now, was instantly beaten into shriveled eggplants, leaving only corpses on the ground and the dying bodies of those who were shot. Screams. The Austrian troops began to walk out of the ruins, and the American troops hiding in the corner became even more confused. You going to surrender soon? The Austrian soldiers formed a line and advanced towards the American army. At the front were several sparse rows of skirmishers. The US military had a serious shortage of artillery at this time. In addition, the east side was its weak link, and there were problems with the training quality of the US military. They poured all their firepower on the skirmisher line. The Austrian skirmishers did not suffer much loss, but the Austrian army's brigade was already close to the American line. Raise the gun. The Austrian soldiers raised their muzzles with black holes. Aim. Shooting. The US soldiers, who had no cue at all, did not actually suffer much loss under the volley of fire, but the pressure was too great. The American soldiers were unwilling to go out and fight. They hoped to use bunkers to fight back just like the Austrian army did before. However, the latter did not choose to continue shooting at the US troops hiding behind the bunker, but chose to charge with bayonets to the surprise of the commanders on both sides. The US military collapsed almost immediately, and a few elites also collapsed after falling into close combat. In fact, Benedek is just testing, and his main force has not yet come up. The US military feels that the Austrian army's behavior is tantamount to suicide, and the two sides should fall into a continuous war of attrition. As a result, the US military had no bayonet training, and coupled with its already on the verge of collapse in morale and poor military discipline, many soldiers did not even want to do the symbolic act of resistance by firing a shot. They just want to leave this hellish place immediately. They are here for golden survival, not death. At this time, the advantages of the Austrian army's discipline and training are reflected. Even if it is such a suicidal charge, these Austrian soldiers who have traveled across the ocean will execute it without hesitation. Under the circumstances, a sudden rout swept the US military. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.